Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Thank you so much for joining us. The BC Refugee Hub, in collaboration with the Vancouver Immigration Partnership, Mount Pleasant Neighborhood House, and UBC Migration, are hosting this learning and dialogue consultation session today. My name is Nadia Carvalho, and I'm the coordinator of the Vancouver Immigration Partnership.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tan Lam, and I'm the Youth and Settlement Services Coordinator for Mount Pleasant Neighborhood House. So before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose territory we live, work, and play. As we are talking about refugees and forced migration today, in the spirit of creating solidarity and cultural connections, we acknowledge the similar struggles experienced by Indigenous and refugee communities in having their stories heard.
Thank you, Tan. For folks joining us via live stream, welcome. We are coming to you live from UBC Robson Square campus, and we're joined here today in person by the over 100 colleagues that registered for this event from the settlement sector, community stakeholders, academics, and former refugees with lived experience.
Okay, so now for a little housekeeping. Number one, please turn your phone to silent. If you do need to take a phone call, of course do so, but please step out of the hallway. Second, there are washrooms on this floor to the left and to the right of the theater. For those wishing to access a gender-neutral and wheelchair-accessible washroom, it's the washroom to your left. And lastly, we have our plenary presentations this morning in this large room, but we will also have 3 breakout sessions this afternoon that'll also be on this floor around the corner. Room names are indicated on the agenda. There are also volunteers today to help us proceed in the right direction towards the room. Please note that breakout sessions hold approximately 25 attendees, so if the room is full for that session, we do encourage you to find another session with open spaces.
Great, thank you. So today is a day to share our learnings and experiences with each other and cultivate an environment of connection and collaboration so we can all continue to better support refugees and refugee claimants in our work. Today's consultation will examine the current portrayal of refugees in the media, explore how technology is empowering refugee communities to reclaim the narrative, and discuss opportunities for the settlement sector and allied community and academic sectors to contribute to the discourse. So let's take a closer look at the agenda today. Some of the plenary session topics for this morning include, we're going to begin our session with Erin Goheen Glanville from SFU, Simon Fraser University, who will speak on growing capacity for refugee welcome, culture, stories, and discourse. Our keynote speaker, Handel Kashope Wright, will present on the psychology of othering and the refugee as an other Canadian. Then we'll take a networking break. For the folks joining us via live stream, we'll be playing 5 refugee success stories, videos, produced by the BC Refugee Hub to highlight the many stories of success and entrepreneurship of refugees in BC as part of the BC Refugee Hub #Refugee Success Story campaign, which just launched this week. Our last plenary for this morning will discuss centering refugees in media coverage and the toolkit that the discourse has created, with presenters Francesca, Fionda, and Alia, Dharssi, who are both journalists. We will also be joined by Sarah Lopez, who is an individual with lived experience who has used the toolkit in working with the media. Then lunch will be served. We have 1 hour for the lunch break with lots of time for networking. At this point, we'll say goodbye to our live stream viewers.
Great. Thank you, Nadia. In terms of the afternoon breakout sessions, the first session is called Ingenuity in the Times of Crisis, Refugees and Use of Media and Technology with Dr. Hamira Alprin, Research Fellow and Instructor at the Department of Sociology and a member of the UBC Migration Cluster. Also attending that breakout session is Hassan Alcantar, an advocate and national speaker. The second breakout session is called Refugee-Driven Narratives and Supporting Agency, Ways in which the settlement sector can support. Leading that breakout session are Ahmed Dani Ramadan, an award-winning Syrian-Canadian author, public speaker, and LGBTQ activist, as well as Munifa Ahmed, a community connector, advocate, and founder of the app Smart to Meet. And last but not least, as also in that breakout session, we have Neela Milad, a UBC instructor and PhD candidate with the Department of Educational Studies. For the third session, it is called Offline Online Skills, a how-to for amplifying and centering refugee narratives. Michael Davis, the Director of Operations for Rainbow Refugee, and the Principal of Public Affairs will be in that session, as well as Hannah Woldes, a member of the Fresh Voices group and collaborator on the Lost Votes campaign. There will be noise. We're just all so eager. Okay, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A in our morning presentations, as well as our breakout sessions in the afternoon. So please have your questions ready, and we look forward to having those discussions during the breakout.
And I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that the BC Refugee Hub, there's Bahar cheering in the background. The BC Refugee Hub is funded by the province of British Columbia and administered by the Immigrant Service Society of BC. The BC Refugee Hub would like to gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology for making today's training possible. So next we'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, our lead up to our keynote speaker, Erin Goheen Glanville, and she'll speak on growing capacity for refugee welcome, culture, stories, and discourse. Erin is a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow in the School of Communications and a research associate at the Center for Policy Studies on Culture and Communities at Simon Fraser University. Her current research is a knowledge mobilization project on the public discourse of contemporary forced migration dialogues in Canada and is done in dialogue with Kinbrace Community Society and other refugee claimant service providers. She runs community workshops shaped by her doctoral research on refugee fiction as pedagogy and is currently writing on creative teaching approaches to critical refugee studies. Erin is the editor of Countering Displacements, a multi-author volume centering the creativity of Indigenous and refugee communities. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Nadia, Bahar, and Tan, and all the others who have worked to bring us together today. It's a privilege to kick off the day, and I'm really glad to see the connections that are built here online, digitally, as well as here in the room. I have been involved at a community level with refugee support, but today I've been invited to speak on the basis of my research. My research project currently is using digital storytelling to create multimedia materials for community education. By way of introduction, though, I'd like to unpack the my before research and just say a few words about that. First, in acknowledging that it's complicated and even disorienting to think about researching newcomer welcome in relation to Indigenous land as a non-Indigenous scholar. And so I just want to say that up front. At times this feels like I imagine it as a kind of open wound in the work that I do, and I need to allow that to be an open question even as I speak about the work that I do. One of the things that I've learned from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous theories of storytelling is that any knowledge or story that I have been given in the course of my research does not belong to me. So I see my research as communally held, as cultural knowledge in the way of stories. And when people generously share stories or perspectives, it comes as a responsibility rather than something that I then own and use. And as well to acknowledge in the my that there's a rich network of relationships that hold my work and hold me accountable as well. So this afternoon, we're going to be focusing on more practical skills, tools and skill building. This morning, we're going to offer a critical sketch of the lay of the land when it comes to people seeking refuge and the media. I want to begin by just talking about a thing called catastrophe. So in media, on occasion, we have what's called a catastrophic event, right? And catastrophe literally means to overturn the order. So a catastrophe in media is a sort of moment or a point of discontinuity in something that would otherwise be continuous, a narrative that would otherwise be continuous, an overturning of the order. And we had something like that happen in 2015 in the lead up to the federal election here in Canada. The thing about a catastrophic media event is that it can't happen twice in the same way that it happens, because once you overturn the order, What happened, the thing that came in as discontinuous, is now a part of the new order. And so you need a new catastrophe to create a new groundswell of information and interest and public opinion about refugee settlement. So as we consider the relationship between media and refugee representation, I actually want to move beyond that model of thinking about campaigning and media to think about the relationship, think beyond the power of campaign to capitalize on catastrophe, and think more in terms of how storytelling might shift culture at a deeper level, how we might think about media as a culture producer in the way that is needed to sustain our work long term. So we'll get to that in a few minutes, but first, Nadia and Bahar in their emails, we talked a little bit about laying a bit of the ground in terms of the challenges of representation in media. So I want to begin there now, thinking beyond the now, and thinking back a little bit. And I thought there's lots of ways to do that, but one thing I thought I might do is just to trace a particular dynamic in media related to persuasion in communication, emotion and reason and persuasion. So to begin, the traditional framework for refugee welcome, I'd like to posit as a starting point, isn't widely persuasive in popular media right now. The traditional framework, the legal foundation, if you will, for refugee welcome is that of human rights, the right to seek asylum, the right to protection. And while the practice of offering refuge has existed in societies as far back as we can trace, today, in the refugee settlement sector and service sector, we work with a practice of asylum that was established in Europe following World War II, right? Resettlement was the primary solution to displacement between the wars, and it's again, in this moment, become kind of the marker of humanitarian action here in Canada. But if we look back to the media coverage in 1939 of the MS St. Louis, which was a ship carrying 900 Jewish refugees, which was turned away by Cuba, by the US, and by Canada, we see that the foundation for claiming refuge, as you see here in this one quote, was human feeling and pity. And this call to action was really easily and directly squashed by a single politician who decided not to have pity. And there's been an apology that's made recently by I think the nephew or the grandson of this person. Nearly a quarter of those refugees died in concentration camps. And the UN Convention, established in 1951 then, was an attempt to produce a rational or legal framework that could ensure that such human rights violations didn't happen again. It established the right to seek protection based on the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified 3 years earlier, 1948. Now, there's a lot of critique, good critique, about what's left out of this legal framework, but I think if we look back across history, we can also see that it has been effective in supporting certain resettlements of particular groups across history, particularly effective for resettling refugees who were fleeing communism. So during the Cold War, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, these particular movements. So this is in 1951. We've established this framework in Europe, a proposed solution to a specific moment in a specific place at a specific time. Yet this document remains the sort of international foundation for defending refugee welcome, despite an increasingly complex context. So I would say that it has been clear for some time that, and this is at the level of rhetoric and communication rather than law, that in popular dialogue, this framework, the language of the right to protection, doesn't have the social purchase that it may once have had. It doesn't have the rhetorical strength of those years. The framework isn't flexible enough, right? It's not complex enough for the present global situation. I'll unpack that really briefly, which is to say that in popular media, the discourses of terrorism, and there's lots of sort of discourse analysis articles that we can go to see how this happens, but the discourses of terrorism, securitization, and illegality have become thoroughly intertwined with questions of refugee rights. This means that people might acknowledge human rights, but then say, but that's not the only thing in the balance. What about my need for security? And it becomes a competition. In addition to these discourses becoming intertwined, the issues of human smuggling, climate change, detention, racism, these are all challenging the foundations of refugee rights and human rights. Does your right to asylum extend to fleeing climate change? Is the framework of human rights strong enough to overcome racist discourses that associate certain nations with certain ethnicities and races? And we can see this especially when we look at the response to the MV Sun-Sea in 2010 here in BC, where politicians and the media immediately used labels of terrorism and illegality, queue jumping, human smugglers, to describe those on the boat before any proof had been given. And this was backed up by the use of detention. The United Nations, the UNHCR, has described the current refugee crisis that we speak about now as an erosion of the commitment to the practice of asylum. We might say we have belligerent nations and we have self-interested citizens, and this brings us to the current space that we're in. I lived in Australia for a while, where my partner is from, and I kind of think about that space when I think about belligerent nations. When I think about the use of offshore processing and detention centers on Manus and Nauru, and consider how that was declared illegal by international law, and yet Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, said on television to the Australian nation, "I don't know about you, but I'm sick to death of being lectured by the UN. We'll do what we have to do to secure our own borders," right? This is the belligerent nation. And it's a saying that rational discourse, that legal framework, you know what, that was good for a time, but we'll do what we have to do. There's a sort of deeper need, felt need, that he expresses. So in the face then of the failure of a rational argument for human rights to convince people of their responsibility, and not wanting to go back to depending on the whim of human feeling, advocates and activists are sometimes pivoting their communication. So this is the interesting cyclical dynamic that you see happening in media toward more emotional or moralistic language, judgmental language, right? So we insist on human feeling and shaming those who would disagree with us. And we can see this playing itself out online, right? In social media, news media comments, also in campaign slogans and rallies. I remember being at a rally for refugee rights at one point, and the chanting was shame, shame, shame. And some friends who were asylum seekers left because it felt like actually quite an exposing space for them. And I wondered, as I was in that space, who are we yelling shame at? Do we expect them to feel it? And if they do feel it, what are they going to do with that? Where do we move from when we're thinking in terms of shaming? And what are we saying, even more importantly, what are we saying about our own work if we frame it as a conversation about shame? So this is part of the cyclical, I think, the back and forth, almost deking each other out, towards rational and emotional argumentation and persuasion. This simplified moral high ground, criticizing, negating everything we disagree with. And I definitely don't want to go in the direction of tone policing at all. I'm thinking more in terms of, as organizations, how we enter this ecosystem, right, of competing discourses in media. And research on messaging shows that kind of approach doesn't really work either, that it shuts down the interest of people who are undecided. So a lot of people are genuinely shaken by global complexities and are not sure how to move forward and need communication that acknowledges complexity, even while it pushes forward in a strong way. I don't know if you saw the article in Refugees Deeply that talked about the backlash against anti-xenophobic campaigns, but just describing how actually sometimes this language, this way of communicating, exposes people who might further exposes people who are already exposed to xenophobic attacks, and that there's a kind of increase in the divisions within this language. So another dynamic to throw into all of this, right, is the suspicion that people have around digital media, consumers of media. Like, as we see the production of media widening, broadening, the means of production, people start wondering, is this fake news? Is this real news? Is this news is this information I know? Is this, So this throws a whole different lens that we could talk about too into the mix. This is a really challenging cyclical dynamic that our communication speaks into. So how do we adjust our communication to be persuasive amidst this complexity is one of the questions that I want to ask. How do we communicate strategically to advocate for refugee rights? How do we engage bystanders without decentering the rights of people who are most affected by forced displacement, because that's another challenge. How can our communication acknowledge the complexity of the world while still advancing our mandates? And part of the answer, I think, is in seeing media not as a tool necessarily for changing perspectives, although it can sometimes be that way, but seeing it also as culture making. And this is where I begin to think about storytelling and the way we do storytelling, the specific kinds of stories we tell. Media as culture formation is kind of like tilling the soil, right, of a community so that it is ready to receive calls for action when we give them. So it's that sort of like pre-mediation work, the work that comes before the media. And storytelling remains one of the most powerful culture shapers. It's a way of expanding people's horizons, invites them into a transformative experience rather than badgering them to change their minds. If it's done in certain ways, I suppose storytelling can do that. But it gives us frameworks for understanding information that we'll hear in the future. So stories kind of give us a sense of, they broaden our imaginative horizons so that when we hear information, we have places to put it. We sort of understand meaning making. And media makers have opportunity in this moment to tell stories that help us to see our connections to one another and help us give us that sense that we can organize ourselves for the common good through those connections. But I want to suggest, too, that if we want to renew the frameworks that we were just talking about that are not currently persuasive, then there's going to be an important stage in thinking about our storytelling that slows right down and starts to collectively self-reflect. Instead of jumping to what stories need to be told, let's begin asking, what are we doing in our work? Why are we doing it? And that could be, in this room, 100 different reasons. The truth is always more complicated and interesting than it at first appears. Why are we doing it, and what does it look like on a daily basis? And is that reflected in our storytelling? And I begin to imagine the beautiful, messy, and very difficult work of the community on the ground that I've been part of or seen. And then I want to ask, why do we persist in this work, and what sustains us as we do? In other words, the tools that we need to cultivate a culture of refugee welcome are probably closer at hand than we know. It's not just about influence or even about sustaining a conversation, right? It's about inviting people into communities of care, inviting people into mutual responsibility, and allowing people to discover that that actually is sustaining and life-giving as a practice. Instead of asking what will sustain the conversation, we ask what has sustained us, and then offer that to others in our storytelling. One gift that people in the resettlement sector have is an entire root system of stories: the good, the bad, the complicated, the simple, our stories, other stories, old stories, new stories, happy ones, sad endings, humanist stories, spiritual stories, all kinds of stories that come out of the work and the community. And I think I would posit that this is part of, this root system of stories is part of what keeps us from being thrown by that negative news cycle that seems to shift the pendulum of public opinion. So I picture the support for refugee welcome as a kind of plant, and I think of refugee welcome as two-way, right? Welcome happens in community as we host one another. So this is not, I'm not thinking about this as a one-way welcome. And if you've heard one simple story, or even 100 stories that are patterned very similarly, right? There's a kind of pattern to humanitarian storytelling. And if we keep telling the same kinds of stories over and over, we create a single root system, like a single root, that's very easily pulled out when something comes to be discontinuous with it, right? And we've seen that here in Vancouver and elsewhere. But for those who have a complicated root system, the storied knowledge, a single negative news cycle isn't going to be able to uproot our resolve to engage with one another. Instead, I wonder, have we got ways for people to enter this root system with us, for us to share this root system in ways that are ethical and careful? How can we communicate this complicated root system to people? My own research is attempting to experiment with kinds of storytelling that are multi-voiced, that bring in creativity, and almost create an example of dialogue in the digital storytelling that I want to create out of them. So the project's public face is called Worn Words, and the idea here is that there's a few meanings to this, right? That we've got a few words that are doing a lot of heavy lifting in the media right now. If you think of some of the ordinary words that get repeated over and over, and I've got some of them up there, they've become worn down from overuse, and they're carrying a lot more than they really can, right? So there's so much diversity held in any one of those words, and they're used in such simple and clear ways that they've started to not have meaning, the richness and fullness of meaning that they could. And so the idea behind my project is I've interviewed a number of people, cross-sector expertise, to speak as experts to these words and to speak back to the words that they have had to wear at times and that may have worn them down at times as well, and to say, this is what I think this word means. This is the problem with the way that it's used. And the idea then is to create a new story, but it's a set of stories. It's not a single story, but a new set of stories for each of these words through the media that I'm creating. So this is my own experimentation with this, and I know that there are other projects too that are happening that are similarly trying to experiment with our form of storytelling. So just a few thoughts. I'm gonna finish up shortly, but just a few thoughts that come out of this project and this work for helping me think through how to share that root system of stories and what good storytelling looks like in the context of digital media. And I'll offer 4 ideas. This is a sort of visualization of the keywords that came up in my interviews with people. I didn't consider the interviews part of like my research data or anything, but this is one way in which I thought, what is the discourse that we're using? And people was the central word there. But you can see that rights in Canada are still really large words. This is still a big part of the discourse for us. Community as well is almost as big as rights. So 4 thoughts, really briefly, and I won't say too much about these, but I'm happy to talk about any of them if you'd like to talk about them during question and answer time. So to draw on this storied root system, how do we do this well? How do we do this in a way that doesn't depend on the catastrophic event, but also can create change? Thinking at this deeper cultural level. So the one is just telling stories creatively and breaking out of patterns, and this requires examining the patterns and thinking through plot, thinking through characterization, right? Like there's these theories of how stories are told. It's a technique, and for this we need artists, we need authors, we need people who are doing this kind of work to show us different ways. So if I go to Netflix to watch a rom-com, right, I kind of know what characters I'm going to find, what plot I'm going to find, and sometimes the same thing happens with humanitarian storytelling. I kind of know the character I might find, the story I might hear. And so how can we draw out or pull ourselves out of that pattern narration? What are the patterns that we're stuck in? How can we be more creative and really in the end more true to actual experiences? The second is cultivating a culture of listening. So this is media that cultivates a culture of listening feels to me very different than media that is trying to influence or create change. So I kind of want to distinguish between those two things. How can we, if we think about media campaigns cultivating a culture of urgent action, right? Ideological influence, perspective change. How can we use our media presence to produce spaces where we listen to one another so that the media actually becomes the infrastructure within which we engage one another? In other words, can our online presence, let's say in our organizations or our work, somehow create that interaction for people to cross over the gulf so that we can actually listen to one another and particularly listen to the people who are most affected in the conversation? So telling stories to elicit curiosity, to cultivate listening, that's different from influence. And for this, again, we need the skill of artists and culture makers, media makers. The third is telling stories that acknowledge complexity rather than simplifying the world. And I've talked about this a little bit, so I won't say too much about that. But one of the things that happened to me as I was looking at my own interview footage and trying to figure out how to put them together is I discovered that listening was a key word. And I had not had that as a keyword. I didn't think of that as an important piece. But everybody in the interviews thought this was really key. And so I put all of those pieces together, just put them all together as a montage. What are people thinking about listening? And everybody interpreted the idea of listening differently within refugee dialogue. But I realized as I put all the clips together, no narrator, so there's no real like reason or rhyme for the way it was put together. And then I've used that in different educational contexts. People always comment, it seems like they're having a conversation with one another in the video. And I think maybe some of the people in the video might disagree with each other in real life, right? But there was a sort of conversation happening, and people could see the dialogue happening, and then say, oh, right, that's how we could dialogue with one another, and then we did that in the classroom. So I think there's different forms or ways of allowing things to be complex and even conflictual in our media, in a way that doesn't degrade the conversation. And then the last one is just embedding digital media in already existing communities so that the conversation can continue beyond the viewing. So we view so much media online. We're oversaturated with information, with stories, with advertisements. So how do we create that sustained community beyond the viewing? And in this, I'm just wondering about the idea of taking digital videos and media into the actual physical spaces where community is already established and underway to create the conversations there rather than leaving it online. So in all of this, the broader question I'm asking is how media making shapes culture and how we can move beyond these repeated attempts to interrupt continuity and instead invite people into a transformative process, how we can move from sustaining a conversation to showing how two-way refugee welcome becomes a sustaining practice for us, and how we can cultivate a culture of listening curiosity. And I think that people who are invited into this will have a better chance of persisting against the backdrop of the pendulum swing of public opinion that we see reflected in the news media and also driven by the news media. So that's it for me, and thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to conversation later.
Thank you so much, Erin. I just want a reminder to everyone that after our next presentation, we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A session with both of our speakers. Our keynote speaker today is Handel Kashope Wright. Handel has been the Canadian Research Chair of Comparative Cultural Studies and the David Lamb Chair of Multicultural Education, and is currently a professor of educational studies and the director of the Center for Cultural Identity and Education at the University of British Columbia. Professor Wright is co-editor of the book series African and Diasporic Cultural Studies, University of Toronto Press, and associate editor of the journal Critical Arts. He serves on the editorial board of several cultural studies and educational journals and book series, including the Canadian Journal of Education and Post-Colonial Studies in Education. Professor Wright has published extensively on continental and diasporic African cultural studies of education, critical multiculturalism, including The Promised Land, History and Historiography of the Black Experience in Chatham, Kent, and Beyond, University of Toronto Press, 2014. His work in progress includes 2 co-edited books on the Black British Columbia and the nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy. Professor Wright serves as UBC's Vice Presidential Strategic Implementation Committee for Equity and Diversity and on the Mayor of Vancouver's Black History Month Advisory Committee. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Wright to give us our keynote lecture today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm late. It's amazing how long it takes to get from Richmond to downtown, and it's even more amazing how long it takes to find parking once you get downtown. So when I got the invitation from Nadia, I thought this was a no-brainer. I thought what was being set out to do here today was absolutely wonderful and more than worthwhile. So for me, it was a no-brainer to sign up to this. So I want to thank everybody who's been involved in organizing this event. The two people I've been in touch with are Nadia Carvalho and Baha Taheri. But I know there are lots of other people that helped to put something like this together, so I want to thank everybody. So the general topic I was given was to speak to the idea of the refugee as other. And rather than speaking about this in media terms, I wanted to broaden the scope and talk about it in Canadian terms, how we all should think about this, but again, referencing the media as I go along. So with that said, I want to deal with the idea of the positive image that we have of Canada, what some people call an image text, right? So what is the image text we have of Canada? And what works for that text and what works against that text? And I want to draw on our cultural theory, Zygmunt Bauman, and his notion of mixophilia and mixophobia, and speak to how we position ourselves and how the media sometimes positions itself. And I want to speak to the idea that the refugee is the other. Oops. I don't know, why am I getting this on the side? I'm a Luddite extraordinaire. So that's not sure. Okay, that's not sure. Okay.
Just there.
Okay. So I want to speak to the idea of the refugee as other. So let's start with the basic idea, right? So a definition of refugee. Oops. So that's not okay. All of a sudden. So this shouldn't be.
Okay. We added a mouse, and that may have thrown things off. Just give us 1 second here. See if that works. Oops. Okay, now we should be okay.
That's not me. And then scroll down. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so what does refugee mean? I'm not trying to insult you by putting that up. Of course, you all know what refugee means. But I'm going to come back to that because this is coming from the government of Canada. But I'm going to come back to the idea that people are fleeing because of war, violence, and persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Those are notions I'm going to come back to, so let's just keep those in mind. So Canada's image text, we all know Canada, don't we? Canada is peaceful, Canada is multi-ethnic, Canada is multiracial, Canada is very tolerant, Canada is multicultural. In fact, we gave the world official multiculturalism. Canada is welcoming, right? So everybody agrees with that, right? This is what Canada is. And we have 3 founding peoples, the English, the French, and indigenous peoples. We have a high rate of multiculturalism. We have high rates of interracial relationships. And our national image text, we don't just talk about ourselves, we always talk about ourselves in relationship to somewhere else and something else. So we're related to Britain in some way, we're related to France in some way, and we're especially related to the United States, and that's where we do some of our best comparison, isn't it? So what does all of this mean for refugees, right? So comparatively, we're doing much, much better than the US in terms of what we think of refugees and how we handle refugee settlement, et cetera, et cetera. All of us were drawn to the comparison between the US and President Trump's call to build a wall and Trudeau's welcome. Refugees are welcome here, right? And the origin of refugees are welcome here is kind of lost on me. I looked back and back and back. Actually went all the way back to a soccer club in England, Warwick, that started this chant, refugees are welcome here. Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here. So who knows where it started, but we all have that nice fuzzy feeling about being in Canada rather than those horrible people to the south of us, right? And I wanted to quote from Justin Trudeau. I don't want to read the whole thing, but this is how he talks. I found this statement fascinating. This was in 2016. Justin Trudeau says, as Canadians, let us recognize our responsibility to continue opening our doors and lending a welcome hand to our most vulnerable neighbors around the world, and on and on and on. It's a wonderful statement if you begin to, Erin could have done this better than I can, but if you begin to take it apart or unpack it, and what do we find when we unpack a statement? Because I've underlined some of those things, right? So that statement gives us all that we want to know about Canada's attitude and values and reception of refugees, right? There's talk about being neighborly, right? So when Trudeau talks about our neighbors, so that reduces the world to a village and refugees as our neighbors. So they're not so far from us. They're not so different from us. Wonderful. Welcoming, open doors, welcoming hand, compassionate, caring for those less fortunate. Canada is generous. So Canada is rich and is willing to share its bounty, right? We extend opportunity. Canada as the new land of opportunity, not the US, right? Equality of Canadians. We're doing what Canadians did before us, right? And what Canadians did before them, right? See the statements. And Canada is the gold standard, right? As he says, as the world knows us to be, right? So he's asserting Canada's gold standard in relationship with refugees. And the idea of continuing that gold standard. We need to emulate the Canadians who came before us and set an example for those Canadians that are to come, right? Now, this kind of image text, this idea of what the nation is, doesn't just come out of nowhere. It is constructed. We actively work on it. And statements like this help us to construct that idea of what Canada is and who Canadians are. And we see how Canada has now superseded the US as the place for refuge. You know, it was the US that was calling, bring your huddled masses and whoever else they're bringing in, right? You're tired and you're whatever. Now it's Canada. So we have superseded the US. And that doesn't happen just by accident. That is worked on, that is constructed, right? And I just wanted to show you some of how, whoops. I think this is in the wrong order. Okay. Maybe you don't have that, but I'll give you, oh yeah, at the bottom here, I have one example. The American dream has moved to Canada from Maclean's. But actually, I didn't want to put all of them. So one of the first ones I found was from the New York Times, May 15, 2014, how the American dream became the Canadian dream, as far back as 2014, right? And then from CNN, March 5th, 2017, is the Canadian dream the new American dream, right? Then April 15th, 2017, the Boston Globe, when the American dream becomes a Canadian reality, right? And then finally, Maclean's picks it up. So the Americans are saying, look, Canada is doing better than us. And finally, we pick it up. Then Maclean says, the American dream has moved to Canada. So you see, the media is playing a role in constructing the image text of Canada. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. It isn't natural. It is constructed. It is worked upon. It is made. And the media plays a role in that making. But there is another side to this. If you're all feeling wonderful and fuzzy and all patriotic, there is another side to this, right? What Himani Banerjee would call the dark side of the nation. What is the other side to this? And it's not that Trudeau didn't deal with this at all. He starts off by saying, as a country, we have had some deeply regrettable moments, like the Komagatu, Maru, St. Louis, and the Chinese Exclusion Act. He mentions that in this same speech. But I wanted to put one or two others up there. So 1919, the order in council in Canada prohibiting landing in Canada of the Doukhobors, Hutterites, and Mennonites, right? The prohibition of the Asian race. The idea that immigration is held limited strictly to citizens of the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and France. At one point, we said, these are the only countries from which we will accept immigrants. Underlying that is a kind of statement of whiteness, of course. I'm very sure that when they mentioned these countries, they did not mean black people from the US. They did not mean Aboriginals from Australia, Maoris from New Zealand, Zulus from South Africa, or even Irish travelers, right? I'm sure what was meant is whiteness, right? And then the treatment of Jews before the Holocaust, this part is really interesting, even after the laws were changed. So before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and immediately after the Holocaust, Canada has a very bad record of accepting and bringing in Jews, right? So what you'll notice with all these examples is that these people are, quote unquote, different, right? From your typical, whoever typical is, your typical Canadian at that time, maybe even at this time. So the first one is religious difference. They are Christians, but my, are they wacko Christians, right? We don't want them here, right? Asians, oh, that's, you know, they're not white, so we don't want them, right? Jews, same thing. They're kind of an iffy category, right? We just don't want them. So there's something going on there. That's why I named this the other immigration history, right? Because I'm doing a double play. That's another history, but I'm now reintroducing the concept of the other. So the other is the stranger. When we talk about the other, who's the other? The other is the stranger. The other is the outsider. The other is a person or a group of people who are out of the norm, someone who does not belong to the in-group, right? Or it's a subgroup that does not have the usual characteristics or values and traditions as oneself, or the inside group. Talking about others is about us and them, right? We are normal, they are not, right? So it's a binary, right? In which the self or the in-group, the majority are normal, right? And we have positive attributes, right? And the other is abnormal. And the other becomes a repository of all that is strange and all kinds of negative attributes. So the other is inferior, the other is less than, the other is usually thought of as less intelligent, the other is immoral. In worst cases, the other is even subhuman. Right? So the other does not fit in, does not belong beside me, does not belong in the group, does not belong in the community or in the nation. And Muslims are a prime example in, today. So we say Islam, Islam, well, it's that political ideology, it's about terrorism, right? It doesn't conform to the kinds of values that Christians have, right? It's a religion of brown people, all those. So you put all those things together, and you can other Muslims right away, right? In a neat way. And it's not just that there's an other, but it's very important to think of the verb othering. We do the work of othering. It's not just that, that person is other. No, we make that person into the other by saying, well, Canada is a Christian country. So the moment you make that declaration, then you are saying, I am othering anybody who isn't Christian. So othering is an exercise of power. Othering is an exercise of power that those who have power use to exclude. I can name who is in and who is out, right? CBC has contacted me to have a discussion about an experience many of you will have had when you're in any conversation or on the street, you're asked, so where are you from, right? That is a kind of othering, right? The person asking the question, I am Canadian, I don't need to account for myself, but you are different. So account for yourself. Who are you? That is a process of othering, right? So people are actively minoritized. When I speak about minority versus majority, I don't just mean numbers, I mean people are rendered minority, right? So people are minoritized. So the caricature we have of Muslim as other and unassimilable in Canada, it comes out of Islamophobia. The Muslim is other because of their religion. Islam is the religion of brown people. It is monolithic. It cannot adapt to new realities. It does not share common values with Christianity. It is inferior to the West. It is archaic. It is barbaric. It is irrational. It is a religion of violence and supports terrorism. It is a violent political ideology. You put all of that together and you say, there you go. There's your Muslim. And those are the people you want here, right? So you're doing that. You're othering them, right? So in the disciplines in psychology and political philosophy, we talk about the other more in terms of interpersonal relations, right? Me and an other, right? In the humanities, the social sciences, and in cultural studies, we speak more towards the communal and the social. Who belongs in the nation, in what nation? So that's all the stuff there is about othering. So why am I talking about othering in the first place? Well, if you go back to those characteristics that the government said are the reasons people might be fleeing, right? They're fleeing because of their race or their religion or their nationality or their political ideology or their membership in a specific social group. You can almost map it straight onto othering, the other. Who is the other? The other is a person of a different race. In Canada, anybody non-white is other, right? So the other based on religion, right? We can either say, this is a state that doesn't conform to religion, or it's about Christianity. So other faiths, Sikhs, Muslims, they are other, right? they are minoritized, right? In terms of nationality, well, you can't get more, more non-national than the refugee, who definitely is coming from another nation, right? In terms of political ideology, what ideology are they bringing? What kinds of ideas do they have? These are some of the fears people sometimes have, right? And social group is particularly important in terms of othering. We do it across race, gender, age, class, sexual orientation, age, ability. So I've spoken about race. So gender, the male is the norm, right? Well, women are all fragile and who knows what they're thinking and whatever. So the opposite of male, right? Age, we have an obsession with youth or middle age at the most, right? Old people should stay home or be forgotten. Very young people don't count yet, right? Social class, the working class, the quote-unquote underclass, no. It's all about middle classness. All the discourse that we usually use is about middle classness. If we talk about working class people, it's to help them come into the middle class, right? Sexual orientation, definitely lesbian, gay, bisexual, all those kinds of people are not the norm, right? So they are other. I've spoken about age, ability, mental ability, physical ability, differently abled people are not the norm, right? So you begin to get what that is, and it's interesting how you can just map refugee directly onto the other. So the refugee is the quintessential other. Right? You can't get more other than that. So how do we deal then with the other? So the social theorist Zygmunt Bauman used the deceptively simple notions of mixophilia and mixophobia to describe two positions we can have to the presence of the other in our midst. As individuals, as communities, and as a nation, we can be mixophilic. What does he mean by that? It means we value and welcome and celebrate sociocultural diversity, including the refugee. So that's what it means to be mixed. And Canada's image text is that we are, by goodness, are we mixophilic, right? Or we can be mixophobic, which is we fear and resent and are put off by sociocultural diversity and the presence of the other in our midst. And I would argue that at the national level, we have not one or the other, but both at play at the same time. So I've said there's this wonderful image text of Canada, and then there's this other reality. And I'm not saying the other reality is the real reality, and I'm not saying the image text is the real reality. I'm saying it's the two. The two are in contention all the time. So that's the way I would invite people to think about the nation, right? It's not a matter of simply triumphantly asserting our mixophilia or condemning ourselves for our mixophobia, but recognizing that rather than either or, Canada is a both-and nation, right? And that beyond the binary of mixophilia and mixophobia is a Canada, including Canadian media, that operates on a continuum, one which positions the nation in between, including when it comes to our attitudes towards and actions towards Muslims. So what we have is all of these things in operation at the same time. We are a multicultural nation, right? And there is a rise in populism, and that is an anti-multiculturalism populism, both coexisting in Canada. We are all about integration and diaspora. We no longer even talk about assimilation anymore, right? We don't want people to assimilate, we want them to integrate. So the language has changed. But we also have populism and we have xenophobia. We're all about tolerance and citizenship equity. We don't say this person is a refugee, therefore not or an immigrant, therefore not a real Canadian. We are all as Canadian as each other, supposedly. Right? But on the other hand, we have white supremacy and racism. We have not only Christianity, but progressive Christianity. Churches, religious groups are active in working to bring refugees to Canada. That's very positive, right? Some people believe in secularism even. It's not about religion, right? But we also have very strong and rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, right? We are positive about youth and middle-agedness. We take care of seniors, but we're also ageist, right? We have queer positivity, we have allyship, but on the other hand, we have not just homophobia. People too quickly jump to homophobia. Sometimes it's not homophobia. Sometimes it's heteronormativity, which is the idea that that which is heterosexual is that which is normal, right? I'm not saying I hate gay people. I just don't want to see them kissing on the bus, right? So it's not homophobia, it's heteronormativity, right? So we have all of that in operation at the same time. We have traditional gender identities, we have tolerance for other gender identities, but we also have transphobia, right? We have traditional gender roles that we value, but we also have sexism and misogyny, right? And the expectation for people to conform, right? So I think if you begin to look at some of the recent headlines, right, you can begin to see some of these forms of politics at play, right? You can see that that is at play. So the recent move to change the laws, right? So if refugees have made claims in certain countries, they soon may not be allowed in Canada, right? So there's a pressure that's leading to this kind of stuff, right? This is relatively recent. Or the fact-checking. The Liberals claim every single asylum seeker gets screened, right? Why do the Liberals need to assert that, right? Because there's another kind of pressure, right? Some of it coming like from the US, right? We need to strengthen our borders, right? So that kind of pressure exists. And on the other hand, other kinds of work exist. Advocates decry changes to law for refugees with claims in other countries. So people are saying, why are we now changing the laws to make it harder for refugees to settle in Canada? Migrants have right to challenge imprisonment before a judge, Supreme Court rules, right? So you can see beyond these headlines what's happening underneath, all these things that I'm talking about. You can see the mixophilia and the mixophobia all bubbling beneath. I hope you can. At least I think I can. Maybe I'm just paranoid. But you can see all of this stuff at work somehow underneath, right? So I want to come to some kind of conclusion here. So I started off with the Canadian dream, the idea all refugees are welcome here. So allow me to end sort of with that statement. So thoughts on refugees and thoughts on Canada as a kind of gold standard. For refugees, the refugee is the other. That is almost unavoidable. What is important is our attitude to the refugee as other. Is it going to be positive and helpful, or is it going to be negative and xenophobic? But I want to assert that we ought not to think of refugee as an identity at all. Many of you might work with refugees. I don't accept that refugee is an identity, in the same way that I don't accept that slave is an identity. There were no slaves. There were enslaved people. Right? Something was done to them. So I rather think an identity is solid. It is what one is. Refugee, to me, is a person facing a set of circumstances, right? A hopefully temporary transitionary condition. So the refugee is an almost citizen on the way to becoming citizen. So refugee is citizen in the making, not just the other. Right? Refugee is almost Canadian, albeit the other Canadian. a piece of what ought to be the horizontal Canadian mosaic. Now, finally, about Canada as a gold standard. The gold standard should not be considered actual, in my view. It should be considered aspirational. It is fragile and in constant danger of being fractured and rendered fool's gold rather than established, given, irrefutable, and perennially bankable. It is not a laurel to rest upon, but a goal to constantly work towards. I started this talk by changing the definitive assertion, refugees are welcome here, which is with an exclamation mark, into a tentative and ambivalent question. Refugees are welcome here? Not so sure about it, right? And I want to end by saying that as we repeat out loud or think positively, assuredly, refugees are welcome here. The original song says, say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here. I believe we need to work continuously to earn that exclamation mark and the end of that saying. We need to be vigilant and to strive continuously to keep that punctuation from slipping from exclamation mark back into question mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very profound. It makes me want to go back to school, if these are what our educators are like today. So I'd like to invite Erin and Handel to join us for a Q&A. I'll open with a question, but then we have two standing mics here. If you'd like to ask questions, please come up to the mic, and then we'll just begin a short Q&A session. No? Yes, there we go. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. First, I want to thank you for making the time to be here. I know that last week was the Congress at UBC in social science with 10,000 people. You guys must, and it was women deliver and feminists deliver. So it's really a moment in time where I think we're open for change, as much as there's a counter force also kind of swelling up as well. So I just really want to thank you for, I know that you have a conference to go to tomorrow, you were juggling daycare, and so just thank you for taking the time to be with us. So I wanted to ask, just picking up on where you ended your presentation, is based on your work and research, and also Erin, how do we live up to the gold standard that we set for ourselves as a nation? You touched a little bit on that in your presentation, but you know, given where you're situated in education, you know, what role does education play? I know that sometimes I often hear people put a lot of weight in that it's the youth, it's children, it's education, and that's where we have to put our emphasis, which is no doubt an important component of this larger change process. But I just wanted to ask you about that. How do we live up to the gold standard?
Well, sure. Why don't we start with the toughest question, and one to which I don't have an answer. I think I'll do a Stuart Hall here and just try to say I need to be modest about it. I don't have a prescription. I think where I left off might be, I don't think it's an answer, but it's a starting point. I think not resting and saying Canada, you know, is the gold standard, and being wary and realizing there's a danger we could slip, and realizing there's more to do. The gold standard is not, it's sort of not, I don't think there's an it, or we have reached the nirvana of refugee reception, right? So I think having that attitude that we're not there yet, and even where we are, there could be losses, and we need to keep thinking in those ways, is maybe a good place to start. And I know you've brought up education in an ambivalent manner, and I would agree with that because I am in the field of education. And I think sometimes people romanticize education. It's because people don't know, right? So I would agree to some extent that giving people the information, giving people the facts is important. In another talk, I spoke about having a vocabulary to address issues of diversity and forms of discrimination is important. What are we calling these different forms of discrimination? I think that is important. The question that people are asked, where are you from? When you feel uncomfortable in your body when you're asked that question, being able to unpack it, to say what is going on there in this exchange that this question comes up, I think is important. But I don't have an answer. I don't have a series of things to say. I just think that as a nation, Canada could do with more reflection and less self-congratulating about how wonderful we're doing. And there's always more to do. And I wonder about what it is we respond to. I mean, Erin knows more about media, the kind of media images that we respond to and why. And who is seen to be suffering and in what way, and whose suffering matters, and when does it matter? I think looking at all human beings as human beings, all refugees as refugees, all Canadians as Canadians is very simple to say, but very hard to keep up with and really put into practice. So I'll stop there.
Erin, would you like to provide your thoughts on that one?
Sure, yeah. I was thinking, you're talking about the gold standards thinking about it as aspirational.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, there's one. Thinking about it as aspirational, and that we need that as part of the discourse as well, and to be having something that we can call people to, but holding that together with the critical perspective. So having those be in conversation, I'm thinking in terms of the way we create media, so that we don't create a sense that the aspiration is the reality. I'm thinking particularly in terms of the humanitarian discourse, and thinking about human rights discourse and the importance of holding that up as aspirational, but also asking the questions of who has at times not been considered human, and how that has affected the way that the discourse has been created and employed. So yeah, holding those things together. A couple other things I was thinking, and I'm not sure if they're totally relevant, they just came to mind when you were saying is, I think there's a humility in saying what we know and know more. And I wonder if that's a piece of the sort of cultural change of, I can speak to this reality and I can't speak to your reality, and so I need to hear you on that. And kind of attached to that is this question of speaking within the categories of privilege that you do occupy, and speaking to people who share that category with you, and the importance of staying in your lane in a good way in those instances. Yeah, so those are some of the thoughts that I had.
Yeah, sometimes our energy is focused on changing people who are different from us in a big arc. But what you're saying is making me think about some of the work that we're seeing emerge through some of the work you've done, some of the work the discourse we'll be talking about later is how we can support refugees to share their own narrative. Or, I was thinking about what you're saying when somebody asks you where you're from. I know my sister in Toronto, it's so diverse now that people are always trying to ask where she's from, what her religion is, and really segment down to the particular part in India that she's from. And now she's just taken to saying, I'm brown, so I'm not sure what that's about, but in Toronto, apparently that's, but obviously it's bringing up feelings, and so to use that moment as a point of educating the other person instead of simply sharing where you're from, which is also sharing your story. And I know I don't always want to do that with everybody I meet, yet I always get asked that. And so what you've made me reflect on is how to use that as a moment to challenge the question, which at times is intended to be othering. And so that's something that I plan to take away from this and reflect on. Does anybody in the audience want to jump in with a question? Tan, yes. Yeah, the mic's great, yeah. Just because of the recording, yeah.
Yes, hi. I had a couple of questions, but I'll definitely just narrow it down. The part that resonated from both of your campaigns is that when we talk about refugee and migration issues, the general public doesn't see it as a human rights issue. They don't see it within that human rights framework, and that's because I think folks here in the sector come from a place of privilege where we truly understand the dynamics of international humanitarian and international refugee law, and translating that to the everyday person is difficult. But I find it interesting because there's also this sense of freedom of speech and the right to share one's views. So it's interesting because if you're talking to someone who may not be on the same page as you, they don't see the right to find refuge as a really, entrenched universal human right. And yet when they argue their point of view or say what they're saying, they really feel emboldened because of this notion of freedom of speech, right? And I think with Bill C-16 and the rise of Jordan Peterson, it's really, you really find interesting people who, even on the left, who may be traditionally open to, more open to having migration and seeing that as a, as a key part in nation building. But you also find people who then are very staunch free speech protectors. So there's almost this contradictory merge of this Venn diagram. And I'm just curious how folks in the sector, and speaking myself as an organizer in the grassroots community, how do we mitigate that, or how do we respond to that? Because I feel like that's another element in this era that we may not have necessarily seen before when it comes to anti-refugee, anti-migrant rhetoric.
I'd like to have my 30 seconds to think first. Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's definitely a tension, right? I have the right to disagree with your identity at times, is the way it's framed, or it feels like it's framed, which is a really unequal relationship in the conversation. I'm just thinking of a high school that I went and spoke at recently, and trying to get them to think a little bit more critically, not about the refugee crisis as a humanitarian issue, but thinking about it in political terms. And it was quite effective to very simply explain to them sort of political histories and interactions among nations that actually make us quite responsible for one another. The extraction of resources elsewhere that have led to our wealth has led to the displacement of populations elsewhere. And to just explain that to teenage kids, at the end they were thinking very differently about the issue being now our context and our responsibility and actions within it. So education can't do everything, but there are some simple facts about the way the world works that people often don't, are not aware of in terms of the way we interact and our responsibility to one another.
I guess this is the morning of there are no easy questions. The idea of freedom of speech, to me, it's a little bit exasperating because we have idealized that to a certain point. Of course, there's limits. Stanley Fish wrote a book called "There's No Such Thing as Free Speech." And it's a good thing too, an essay or a book, right? Which people can look up. And he wrote that up quite a while ago. So I think one of the things that we might want to begin to unpack, of course people are going to have different viewpoints, right? We shouldn't have one story, as I was listening to Erin. So we have these stories in conversation, right? But one of the things that we might begin to look at is somebody hiding behind the skirts of freedom of speech to undertake freedom to offend, right? So what is the goal of what it is you're doing? You can easily call somebody on that very quickly, right? Say what you're saying right now is really hurtful and offensive, and all you're saying is you have the right to offend. So let's get down to brass tacks. That's what we're doing, right? Is that what we're doing? You can call somebody on that. So you switch from freedom of speech to, okay, you're asserting your right to offend. Okay, now I get where we're speaking from, right? Let's continue the conversation, right? But there are also other positions that people are coming from when we want to appeal to people. Because not everybody is saying, I just hate refugees, I don't want them here. There are also people you can appeal to in other ways. Lots of people love to be philanthropic, right? Wouldn't it be good if you could, just show how much we have and how much we can give? I'm not a big fan of philanthropy, but that can appeal to some people, right? So you have to be, how do we shift the discourse so that it appeals to the person who's saying, I don't want to get into all this refugee stuff and I don't know why they're coming here. Erin's point is a really good one about our relationship to other places, how what we're doing here is affecting people elsewhere, right? We're all connected. Look at the embarrassment of how much we think we're working on with issues of the environment, and the Philippines is saying, here, come on, take your garbage back. How many of us knew we were shipping garbage to the Philippines, right? So what you're doing in one place is affecting people in another place. So, Erin's point of, you can talk to people and say, this is how what we're doing here affects people over there. Part of the reason why they're coming here, people used to say to the British during the Empire, it's because you were there. The reason why there are a lot of Indians in London is because they were sitting in India peacefully, and you went to India and said, we're very superior in London. So I thought I'd come check it out. Right? So that's, but we need to realize that our actions have reverberations, right? And appealing to just the humanitarian, and sometimes that doesn't work, but think of that as well. So there are different discourses. As you're speaking to somebody who says, I'm against refugees coming, you want to tease out, well, where's this person coming from? Where are they starting from? And as you're saying, some people are saying, do we have enough resources to share with others, right? And part of the answer could be, can we afford not to share with others? Maybe if we shared more with others where they are, they wouldn't be coming here in the first place. So all of those, there are different kinds of discourses, as Erin and others would say, different kind of discourses that are at play, and you might want to choose one or tack and see which one is appealing or what you can use to appeal to somebody, with you having your eye on the prize of saying, I want us to come to a place where you think that bringing in refugees or more refugees is a good thing.
Thank you, Handel. So we have another question from the floor.
Hi. So my name is Swad. I'm from Pacific Immigrant Resource Society, and I work with refugees. And my question is for Dr. Wright, please. So refugees are welcome here. So what do you think, Doctor, your own, your personal view? Do you think Canada is doing better than other countries or continent, for example, Europe? Because my client think that they are really lucky to be here in Canada, because at least they can have the right to citizenship, to be Canadian one day. And I would like you to tell me, what do you think about the other in those two places? What is the view of European regarding others, like the refugees, I think, and here, Canada? Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, thanks for keeping up with the no easy questions thing that we do. Is Canada doing well? Yes, the simple answer is yes. Canada is doing better than a lot of other countries. There are countries that are doing way more, which much, much less. If you think of the number of people that the number of Palestinians in Lebanon, for example, right, with almost no outside help, right? So there are countries that, without making a big noise about it or saying, they're just saying, you know, these are our brothers, what can we say? You know, they came in, you know, we try to make it work somehow, right? So there are other countries that are doing a heck of a lot more with huge numbers of people, with very few resources, and not making a loud noise about it. So the way Canada is doing it is I don't know, a little showy. It's like, see how much we're doing, especially compared to the US, et cetera, et cetera. The issue you bring up about compared to Europe, but history is also important. We're living in a particular moment where there are shifts. There used to be maybe more openness in Europe to immigration, but limits also, right? You can stay in Germany as long as you want. You'll never become a German citizen if you move there, right? So some countries have that kind of rule, you know, it's a matter of blood. Nationality is a matter of blood, right? We also now have a new kind of idea of fortress Europe, which is part of the new populism, right? Which means that countries like Hungary are saying, no, we're not accepting anyone. We're actually building walls, et cetera, right? You have Angela Merkel's wonderful about face from declaring several years ago this multicultural thing is not working in Germany, to saying, I will let in hundreds of thousands of refugees into Germany, right? So it's a patchwork of things. And you begin to see how much economics plays into it. That becomes a big answer to why people are not accepted. And when people are accepted, what happens? I mean, in Finland, for example, they accepted a while ago a whole number of Somalis. And as a gesture, the Somalian community went out and donated blood sort of almost en masse. And that blood, as far as I was made to understand, was not used. Right? So how do people feel welcome and part of the nation if your blood can't mix, literally cannot mix with the nation, you know, if that story is true? So there are different attitudes in different places, different ways of thinking about it, different histories of accepting others in. You know, Canada is quote unquote a land of immigrants, which might be part of why we're doing well, but it doesn't fully explain it. The US is also a land of immigrants, and look at what's happening there now. So it's a patchwork of things, but I think there are real dangers, the new populism, the appeal to the old idea of what the nation is as opposed to the state, the nation state, a kind of turn back to homogenization, all of that kind of stuff is real, is there, and is affecting the work that people like yourself do. It exists in a lot of places, a lot of quote-unquote white majority countries, and even non-white majority countries. The stuff that's happening in India around minorities sometimes can be, you know, really problematic. So I'll stop there.
What's that? Yeah. Oh, I wanted to respond as well, if that's all right with you, because it speaks to this tension that I sometimes feel, particularly when we think about the trope or the repeated characterization of refugees as grateful, so the grateful refugee, right? And we have critiques of that, and at the same time, it is genuine experience for people. And so, like, how do we bring together the critique of this representation that forces you to kind of position yourself in a certain way, and yet that is part of your experience as well. And I remember doing focus group research where I talked about sort of representations of people as victims, and I was like pushing against that. I felt that this was not a good way for working towards integration. And the people in the focus group said to us, actually, we are victimized. We have gone through a lot of suffering, and we do want suffering to be represented in the public media. And so for me, that was a good moment as a critical academic to be thinking, okay, so there's There's stuff that happens, there's a reason why these things become part of the public discussion, because it's genuinely part of people's experiences, and yet at the same time we need to hold that in tension with the critique that is also true. So in the case of Canada, you know, perhaps Canada's, the private sponsorship agreement, that's something that's pretty incredible in international context, right, and unique. And yet at the same time, a big part of it is geography. We are in a place that's separated from a lot of the world. We have one border with the US, and up until recently, people didn't need to or didn't want to, in large numbers, seek asylum. So we have kind of a geographic privilege of being able to think about what would we like to do, who would we like to have come here. And so certainly when people feel they're the lucky ones, they've gotten to Canada, you know, that's a genuine expression of, you know, the way geography is organized in the world. But it's not a reason for self-righteousness or a pat on the Canadian back. You know, we could do worse. We also, there's a reason why we're able to do this in terms of what we have geographically. I don't know if that is also a bit of another part of the patchwork, I suppose.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? Oh, we have a couple. Okay. Go ahead. Okay.
Oops, I'm too short. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the great presentations. I think it's good to come to these events to be updated, to think, to reflect, to learn from each other. This question is something Dr. Wright just said about identity. And refugees is not an identity. I mean, to be a refugee is an identity. I would like you to expand more on that. You said refugees are people who are because of specific circumstances, but they should not be seen just the identity. Or I would like you to expand more on that, because when we see media, the only way the media talks about refugees is by saying, refugees from here, refugees from that, but doesn't go beyond that. And maybe could be linked a little bit of when we talk about studies and the forming or shaping of culture, how we can talk about refugees not as a sole identity. I don't know if it makes sense, my question. My question makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that this is a legal label, right? And it gets worn by people or put onto people. And so people, every individual has kind of a choice about how they want to interact with that label. Do they want to claim it and say, I am a refugee and I want to, as my friend Raul Gattaca does, he says, I'm going to, at every point that I'm given some sort of accolade, I'm going to claim that term refugee for the sake of other people, even though he hasn't been a refugee for ages, you know, in legal terms. So there's different ways of relating to that label, I suppose, and I respect a lot of different decisions in how people want to take it on as an identity or not. And I think part of the point that I heard from Dr. Wright is just around the transience of that as an identity. So it comes and goes. It's not necessarily something people have chosen in the initial stage, and how you claim it or don't claim it is kind of a matter of your own politics and personal story. So, I mean, in the media that I'm trying to create, refugee is one of the key words where I'm trying to say, what do you think about this word? What do you think about this word? You know, a way of diversifying how we think about what that word even means when it's lived, rather than when it's kind of imposed as a legal status. I don't know.
Thanks. I really like your response, because you complicated my complication even further. I think I was trying to be provocative, you know, and Erin's taken it even further by saying, let's not take that label for granted. And because it's bringing so much baggage with it. But as you say, some people might take it on and say, you know, yes, that's, you know, like people have taken on lots of other terms, like gay, for example. People can proudly say, yes, I'm gay, or yes, I'm queer, right? queer was originally derogatory, right? But you can reclaim it, right? So maybe you can do that kind of work with refugee. But I want to say at the outset that we use it so much, it's so much part of the discourse, part of the media discourse, part of the legal discourse, that we solidify it. We're saying, this is your actual identity, right? I don't think people are refugees as an identity. They're refugees because something has happened, right? You can say somebody is a man or a woman. There are things that they do. They're a doctor. They're a cab driver. They're a homemaker. Even those things are kind of shaky, but they are identities in a way. But I think refugee sucks so much oxygen out of everything else as a label. And that's what I wanted to challenge by saying, can we pause for a moment and think of a human being, or somebody who was once a cab driver, or somebody who's a great family man, somebody who's a comedian, a football player, something, rather than this person is a refugee. Because, yeah, they are that category, and thanks for the reminder, it's a legal term, but people are much more than that. And it's the reduction that I'm struggling against, and I'm inviting us to think beyond.
Thank you, sure.
It just reminds me of this activity that I sometimes do in the classroom to draw out the sort of absurdity of thinking of a person as only a refugee, or is that their entire identity. As I get sort of introduced, you often say, you introduce someone, this person is a refugee. And so I say, let's do the same thing, but with the word citizen. So this is my friend, they're a citizen. What does that tell you about my friend? Nothing really, except that they've got a legal status, right? And so we kind of do this, we play it out. Like what does that even mean? So that there's some creative ways too of thinking about how you you unpack or denaturalize that.
Thank you. It's great to have both of your perspectives here. It's a great energy. So we have 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to break. I realize I've crept into the break time, but we had a substantial break time for networking, and I think we can find some other opportunities to do that at lunch. And I think this conversation has been great and such a great opportunity to bring these two individuals and academics together to help us see some of the patterns and make sense of what's going on. So the next person there, thank you.
Hi folks, my name is Nadia, and I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the concepts that came up today, because I think that going beyond the label of refugee, I think this brings up a lot of concepts around belonging and what does it mean to belong in a country. And so just to think about that, whatever way we land on this space, there's this race for citizenship, right? You want to have your citizenship, you want to get your passport. But then beyond that, what does it actually mean to belong here? So for example, last year, Trump developed the Muslim ban. And so I was born in one of those 8 countries that he banned. And despite being a citizen, whatever that means, you realize that you don't have power over who accepts whether or not you belong, even if you have citizenship. And so, who decides whether we belong here, and why is it that they get to decide? And there's also this notion of, especially when you're a racialized person and you're representing a country that's not, given the identity of whiteness, if you come from that country, despite what you look, you still might not be given that title of white. You come to this country and then you have to represent your entire race. You have to make sure that you don't do anything wrong, because if you do something wrong, this will represent everybody in the country that you come from. So for example, again, last year in Toronto, there was a van attack. And I remember thinking, please don't let this person be Middle Eastern, and please don't let them be Muslim, because I know that everybody from that community, no matter what their citizenship status, whether they were born in this country or not, they will have to pay for it. And so it really begs the question of, even once we get past that point, whatever your status is, what does it mean to belong, and how do we change that culture? Because it moves beyond your status sometimes, and it goes to what you look like, what your race is, what your gender is, what your sexual identity is, and all of those things.
I didn't even get the 30 seconds. So one's identity and the idea of belonging, I think it's not a one-way street. You work hard if you're from outside of Canada to belong, and part of what you do is the sort of the legal stuff, right? So you might become a permanent resident, or you came in as a refugee, and then you work towards citizenship, and you think you're working towards this stuff like that. So you get your citizenship, and it's like, voila, this is my magic card. I now belong, and you have a celebration, and you dance, and people think it's wonderful. If you're not from here, most of you had a party when you got your citizenship. Don't deny it. But then you're brought up against other forces that question whether you belong or not. So there's this constant questioning. When do you belong? You know, and it's not just about the nation. There are all kinds of categories where your belonging is constantly postponed. I've written, for example, about being black in Canada. So I'm originally from Sierra Leone, from Africa. And I can ask the question, so when will I be black, right? Because even within blackness, there's some people who say, oh, well, you're Sierra Leonean. I remember I taught in the US, and when I got my first job, somebody who was black said to me, oh my God, you're here? Are you, oh, so where are you coming from? And I said, I'm from Sierra Leone. Ah, no wonder you got hired. So the idea is you already know my politics, right? I'm a token, acceptable black, grateful to be in the US, therefore I was hired, right? So even within the category black, I was being excluded, right? So it's not just about the nation, and it's not just about citizenship, but people will play citizenship games with us, right? They will use your accent, they will use your skin color, so it's like a way of saying, you either don't belong or you will never belong in the way that I belong, right? Or they can say, the idea is my family has been here for so many generations, or I now speak, quote unquote, without an accent, which is a very strange thing for anybody to say, because there's nobody who speaks without an accent, because you speak with a Canadian accent or some kind of Canadian accent. So all those things are used. It's power games, right? So all those things are used to exclude you or to include you in a paternalistic way, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be aware of that. So somebody said to me, well, I don't, a radical black person said, I just live here. I don't even think of myself as Canadian. So you give that up. Yes, I have citizenship or whatever. I'm not Canadian. I'm African with a K. Okay? So that's another kind of take. I just happen to be here, right? So I opt out, right? So I don't know that becoming a citizen is all that is the be all and end all of it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just really briefly just acknowledge the pain of that thing that you're describing. Yeah, and then also just to say. That what I want to do out of that is to show clearly to people how, we think of citizenship as a protection or a right, giving us rights, but we are all vulnerable. If one of us is vulnerable to losing our citizenship, we are all vulnerable in some way. Citizenship is not the answer to belonging and safety for any of us. And so I think that's where I want to move in terms of organizing in solidarity.
Thank you. And just to the next and last question. Thank you.
Hello, Erin, I'll be brief. I know we all want to go for a break. So I guess based on the conversation, I am hearing that, it seems that pity on one hand of the continuum and fear is the other thing on the other end. And so how do we communicate to the average person on the street? What can we have in the middle? Because I remember I'm a practicum student, graduate social work student with VAST, being here today, and I'm really appreciating the conversations. But when we see somebody on the street and they're like, oh, I'm working with refugees, oh, be careful. That there is that weird dynamic. So how can we communicate to just the average individual not to take the side of pity, not to take the side of fear, but what can we find in the middle when we have those conversations, especially when the media might seem to twist things in different directions? Thank you.
I feel like there's just a broadening of all sorts of emotions and affects that we can bring into there, which have to do with the joy of human connection. And, there's all sorts of places that we could go in terms of affect. One thing that this may be not a direct answer, but one thing that your comment made me think of is Sarah Ahmed's work on the cultural politics of emotion. And actually, she sees fear and love being really interconnected, and pity and love. And so thinking about what we think is the polar opposite of fear, which is love, right? And then looking at, let's say, Trump's address, where he said, we don't fear you, we just love those on the inside, right? And then you think, okay, what are the politics of love? Not that we don't want to love, not that we don't want to move in that direction, but that maybe that needs some interrogating too, like on what basis do we love one another as human beings? And maybe that's a good place to start the conversation. I don't know. That's just one thought.
And then I'll leave you with the last word.
I was going to say what she said, because I had a whole section on affect and emotion and Sarah Ahmed's work that I took out of this presentation, and you've raised it. So yes, there is a lot we haven't talked enough, and part of why I joke sometimes is because the stuff that we're dealing with is hard to deal with. So sometimes it's a deflection. I teach critical work, and my students, some of whom are here, right, know me, that I'll also joke, right? But it's not a joke, right? What people are going through is not a joke. And the things you raised, yes, and there are even other emotions beyond that fear and that, There's the general discomfort, right? There's anger. So what are the emotions, and sometimes also what are the expectations of the refugee? Which is why I keep saying, refugee is not a refugee, because the refugee comes with those expectations. God forbid there's a refugee who's not grateful. Where's the story of their success? And aren't they grateful to be in? Wow, what kind of refugee is that? Right? So we want those. We need those narratives. We want that easy shot. When Erin said, "Well, if I ask somebody, this person is a citizen, what does that mean?" It doesn't tell you anything about them. If you say this person is a refugee, it doesn't tell you anything about them, but it is telling you something. That answer tells, people have that storehouse of knowledge, supposed knowledge, about who or what a refugee is. And they bring that to the fore, right? Somebody to be pitied, somebody that is dangerous, to be angry about, somebody to avoid, all those things, right? So it's the stereotyping, and it's the ease with which we step into the stereotypical, and we don't take the time to do the work of unpacking that I think both of us have tried to challenge here today.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. I think when I face that kind of thing, I always try to bring people into communities that don't look like theirs. And sometimes in the city, we run on parallel tracks, and so it's more of that integration work, I think, is really important so we can stop othering. So now, the long promised break. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And so what we'll do, since we took more time than expected, if we can convene at 11:15. Is that okay, Bahar? Yeah? Okay. All right. So we'll see you back in here at 11:15. We're going to have 2 journalists from the discourse focusing on centering refugees in media coverage. And they've developed a lot of tools, practical tools, for addressing some of the othering that we've been talking about this morning. So they're actually changing the narrative from the inside, from the newsroom. So I'll see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
My family is still back home and I don't want them to get harmed. I was trying to bring change, positive change into my country. I work for the betterment of the government and there are people who don't like that. Insurgents, you call them the warlords or you call them anyone. So they were the people who were not happy with the bringing positivity or change in the society or the community or the country. I'm from Afghanistan. I worked in an NGO which was supported by the government, and I came to Canada just for a better future, for the safety of myself and my family. The refugee claimant process is good, it's transparent, clean, but lack of resources make it lengthy. And it's put you in a limbo or an ambiguity, like what you will do, right? Like you stay here and your family is back home. I mean, especially for a person with a family, it's very difficult to concentrate. It was a challenging year to find a job suit my skills. I'm a skilled worker. I had working experience in finance, accounting, project management, procurement, HR or human services or people services. So those were all aligned with international best practices. But finding a job, there was a challenges in the employment agencies to attract those skills. Like you can see there are many refugees who are skilled, but doctors, engineers, but unfortunately they are not in their place of work they should belong to. So I just started working in a warehouse, which was just to get rid of the welfare and to just earn something on my own hands. Currently I'm working in the bank now because that was my profession. Like I knew the admin, finance and accounting, so I just kind of did some courses, adjusted myself, and now back to life. And I'm studying masters in SFU and I'm paying for my pocket. So it's a bit difficult sometimes. You always think about your family, so that's why I cannot focus on my career much, because for me my family is very important. So if they are not safe, how can I, if they are here, that will give you some sort of relief, then you can have your normal life. Being a refugee in Canada, overall public is very supportive and diversified. So, but again, if there are some people who think that we're stealing their jobs or lifestyle or something, it's not about that. It's like, as I said, I'm working. I'll give my example, and there are plenty of more like who have their skills. We need some time to just get ourselves fitting into society. Like it takes time. As I say, the culture, the values, everything is different, but gradually, slowly, you will fit in. And I mean, this is my second year in Canada, so I'm already contributing to the society, in my work, in my education, and also through the taxes and all those things. We need some little of patience from both sides, for the refugees and from the people, but eventually we will succeed and we'll come together, yeah. So just don't lose hope, try hard and keep working, keep studying. There's plenty of opportunities here. It's up to you how you take that. If you take it positively, you will go in a positive way.
Lo más difícil, adaptarnos.
For us, the
Adaptarnos en
most
cuanto
difficult thing was
a-
to start from scratch.
Obviamente allá en nuestro país teníamos siempre con mi esposo.
We had a company in Honduras, we had
una
many
empresa,
things there, and we
teníamos,
have to leave them
ya
and
estábamos
start from
establecidos y
scratch.
volver a comenzar de cero. pues nosotros somos un vivo ejemplo.
We were
Estábamos
doing
bien
very well
en nuestro
in
país,
Honduras, but we started having
trabajo,
problems there because of the
generábamos
security
empleo,
and
no
safety,
suscitó un problema.
and that's why we decided to
Supimos
come
ya
here.
de este país
But
porque
we are
habíamos
really happy
a-
because we had the
primero
opportunity
el
to
problema
grow
pasó
and,
con mi
and
hermano, sobre todo
to
que era lo
make
que
not the
estábamos
same,
buscando,
but
y
similar
además de
things,
eso,
like
hemos
make a company
venido a
and make
emprender,
it
que
grow
era lo
up
que hacíamos allá
and
en
work,
nuestro país,
and that's
y
a
ahora
huge
lo
opportunity
estamos
for us,
haciendo de
and
una
we
manera
think
diferente, pero
if we can do it,
también vemos que
it's
estamos
an
haciendo
example
las
for
cosas
many
bien.
others.
Los conocimientos que veo que más que hasta el sol de hoy
I
me
was
está,
the manager in
sirviendo
the
es el saber
company
que
that I
dirigir
used to
personas,
work in
¿verdad? Lo
Honduras,
hice como empleado
and
siendo
I knew
gerente de
how to
producción,
hire
tenía
people, how
20
to
personas
teach
a
them
cargo,
what they should do,
dirigiéndolas. Cuando ya
and
tengo
that
mi
is the
negocio,
most important thing that I
ya
just
puedo
transferred to
dirigir
here,
personas, aún
and
en
I
Canadá,
am
siento
very
que tengo esa
good
facilidad de-
in hiring and
he
to
puesto
teach
anuncios
people,
por
and it's a
Facebook,
transfer, just
busco ver
transferring
de qué
skills,
manera
even
rápido
though
la gente
it's
me
a
busca.
different
Tengo esa facilidad, entonces eso
work
lo traduje
there than here. At the end,
inmediatamente aquí. O sea,
people, it's the
vine-
same here and
vine
there.
con este conocimiento y ese
And for me, it's
conocimiento
like
también lo
very
apliqué
easy.
aquí. Y eso es algo que lo he puesto en práctica. La verdad, hemos tenido, primero es el expandir más la empresa.
My
Más
interest
grande
is
sea la
not to be
empresa, entonces va a
famous
ser más
or,
estable.
but
Va a ser
the
más
bigger the
difícil
company,
conseguir
I will
caso
hire more
que
people,
pueda
and they will have
cerrar.
money to
Aparte de
buy
eso,
things
pues,
to
el
be
apoyo a
to
las
live.
personas que
So
están
for
por
me, the
parte
most
de la
important thing
familia,
is
de
to
los que
to have a
vivimos con
very
nosotros,
big
de los
company,
que han trabajado con
well
nosotros,
established,
¿verdad? Parte de
and
gente que ha
that's
estado aquí también,
the
porque han
the
sido
way I
muchos.
can help people to
Entonces,
get
no
hired.
tanto por alguna ambición, porque en cuanto a cosas personales todavía no tenemos una casa.
And
Sí
also,
tenemos,
for example, we
por
don't
ejemplo,
have a house. For us, it's most important, the company, we have a good car, that it's good for all the materials and all the workers that we have. And that's more important than having a house or having money. It's the interest of us is to hire people.
Reúne requisitos pues para una compañía pueda ser bastante fuerte. Son las dos cosas.
When we
Diría yo,
came here, we didn't
fundamentales
have the
como para que uno
opportunity to
pueda
work,
desarrollar las
but we
demás
saw that there
necesidades,
were many
¿verdad? Teniendo
different
seguridad
options,
y trabajo.
like in
Y
the
veíamos,
painting,
trabajo de
construction,
trabajo
and
de-
different
de-
things to do.
de jardinería,
And
de
so we
todo
were
tipo de trabajo
happy
mirábamos
to
por las calles,
work
entonces
after we got
veíamos,
our
todavía
documents.
no
And
trabajábamos
also,
porque no teníamos un
I think
permiso de
the most
trabajo.
important is
Una
for
vez que lo
us
obtuvimos,
is
pues,
safety and
comenzamos
work
en lo que-
are the main,
en lo
and
que,
then the
pedimos,
other
¿verdad?
things
Fue
will come.
pintura.
It was difficult, like for me, I was civil engineer, but here our certificate doesn't work, so we have to upgrade and it takes time, and for the beginning we have to work, so any work, so we did like construction or moving or any hard job, right? So that was the only hard part of when we came here at the beginning. I came because here is safest country for us, and we got a lot of problem at my back home as I am Kurdish, I'm from Iraq. I came like a refugee claimant, so I applied, and our process was very easy that time. It was like almost 2 years ago. I decided to open my own business and with my partner actually. Back home I had like small business, but it was totally different. But I have that skill to how to manage, how to grow up, how to organize even small business. So yeah, I had that skill. So that's why I try here to open my business and try to grow up. We have right now 3 trucks. We do residential and commercial moving, local moving and long distance moving. We hire other immigrant and refugee clients in here. They choose this country as future, so they need like a good credit and good background, so they work very hard and they pay taxes, they pay everything. So we want to help them because they are at the beginning and they need money, and of course, yeah, we want to help them. When we came here, same way. So yeah, it was difficult, but step by step we grow up, yeah. I enjoy communicating with people. Like I could like obtain customer, and especially they were happy when they finished the job. They text me or call me. They said your team was great. You did a great job for us. Thank you. I recommend you. Like this kind of things. It makes me very happy and very comfortable. Better, like more than getting money. So we focus on how to make our customer happy, and their happiness is our priority actually.
When I come to Canada, I have just $600 with me. The government first helped me. I take salary for government, for rent the house, for I pay food for my kids. I take an SSHRC program for language. I take level 3 in English. After that, I open my company. I have a company in my country, Syria, and I open my company in Syria here in Canada, tiling, carpet, laminate, drywall, painting, stone in outside, everything for the building. After open my company, I make $25,000. Now I have 6 guys work with me, and if anybody looking about the work, I can help them. If I have space, work with me. I feel so happy because everybody wanna help, I can help them, and I wanna help the government because the government helped me. النجاح هو إنه
Success is that basically being able to depend on yourself and not depend on any other person. Success doesn't come out of nowhere. You have to work hard, you have to go all the way out and do something and achieve something. And when you actually do something and it ends up being successful, it feels great, and nothing can compare to that feeling.
I want to say thank you for Canada, thank you for people Canadian help me for come to here. I make good money, I make everything. I am very happy. I stay now in Canada.
So when I first moved to Canada, I didn't know how to go around and do things, but now that I came here, I've become much more self-reliant, much more independent. I go and I come and I do things on my own, so much more independent.
Taipei is a social enterprise that aims to provide newly arrived Syrian women chefs with an opportunity to have jobs, to gain financial independence, to hone their skills and to make friendships, and also spreading Syrian food. So our first pop-up dinner happened about 1.5 years ago now. The tickets sold out faster than we ever could have imagined, and the first dinner was a success. We got a bigger venue, our team of Syrian ladies grew, And so we realized that, it's time to turn Taipei into a full-service catering company. Taipei is an Arabic word that means kind in the feminine form, and in the Syrian or Levantine dialect it means delicious. The one thing that I find to be sort of the biggest telling sign of success is the impact I feel on the ladies themselves, their ability to be financially independent, to be the ones holding the purse strings at home, and the level of self-confidence that I see in them now versus a year ago has been incredible.
It's a wonderful thing because I'm working with other ladies whose circumstances are very similar to my own. And so it's great now I'm working with this group and we've made friends and we know how to work together. I love the fact that I'm working with women from my country. I love cooking. I love to cook, so I'm very happy to be working in that field. And I'm very happy to be showcasing the food from my country. Success is finishing university, it's improving my language skills, but also Taipei's success is my success, because when we're offering this food that people love and ask for, that means we and my culture are successful. My family is successful.
Every single dinner we've put together so far has sold out in a heartbeat. And the excitement they bring when they come to the kitchen every day and telling me about the conversations their kids have had with other kids when they say, my mom is a Taipei chef. The pride that they take in that, to me, is very moving. And I feel like I'm maybe doing something right for someone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Munifa, and I'm so happy here to be moderating for this session. I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and originally I'm Ethiopian. Currently, I am working as a digital analyst and marketer, and I am advocating for climate, and I'm pursuing my passion by building a web application called Smart Meat. So a reminder to everyone that after our next presentation, discourse centering refugees in media coverage, we will have a panel discussion, Q&A session with both of our speakers. And we will be also joined by Sarah Lopez. Okay, sorry, I was very loud. So we are We are going to have the presentation by Alia Dharssi, is a freelance journalist, researcher, editor based in Vancouver. She has written widely about immigration, refugees, global development, and sustainability for Canadian and international media, ranging from Vancouver Courier to the New York Times, and is a deputy editor of Asparagus, a magazine about sustainability. In 2016, Alia spent a year investigating Canadian immigration policy to produce a 6-part series of Calgary Herald and the National Post that revealed ways in which immigration policy is resulting in billions of dollars in losses to the economy each year, and highlighted how policies push thousands of workers into Canada's underground economy. And we are also welcoming Francesca Fionda, is a data reporter with community-engaged journalism organization, The Discourse. She has covered stories about First Nation housing, child welfare, refugees, and worked on the national investigation with Global News and CBC. She currently lives in Vancouver and is second-generation Canadian, with both parents immigrating to Canada from Philippines and Italy. While she can speak a little Italian, she only knows inappropriate words in Tagalog. Please welcome Alia and Francesca to the stage.
Hello, thank you everybody for joining us, and Thank you for the great introduction. Alia and I are going to be talking a little bit about a toolkit that we produced in collaboration with 30 newcomers, and we'll also be answering questions afterwards, but we wanted to acknowledge that everyone here in this room has so much expertise and knowledge and experience that if at any point during our presentation you want to contribute a comment or a question, just raise your hand, and before we change slides, we'll invite you to share what your perspective. So feel free to put up your hand if you have anything that you wanted to contribute. So to start, we're just going to go over Journalism 101. Alia and I have a lot of different experience in the media, and we're going to cover a little bit about journalism, and then we're also going to be covering a little bit about the basics of what you might want to know if you're approached by a journalist. So when it comes to journalism, we decided to break it up in two different ways. One is that there can be a variety in terms of what kind of a story a journalism outlet is going to be sharing in terms of the medium. How is it going to be presented? Is it going to be in television, meaning that there'll be video cameras, you'll be on TV, you could be on YouTube, is it radio, is it online? There's newspapers, magazines, and podcasts. There's all sorts of different ways that a story can take shape. And because of that, that would mean that a journalist who's approaching you might need might have different questions. If it is more of a visual medium, that means that they're going to need pictures, that they're going to have a camera. If it's radio, that means they're going to be recording your voice, and you could be have a microphone and be speaking for a long time, and they might take little clips of you. And then the other way that journalism can vary is in its process. And that can be, for example, daily news, where you see stories, you hear shorter stories that are very quick, and they have to be done in a very quick manner so that reporters have a turnaround that can be just within the day. So by the end of the day that they are looking for someone to speak with. And then there can be longer stories, which are investigative and feature stories. And those ones can mean that a journalist might approach you more than once. They maybe will meet you for coffee in a more casual way and then do a more formal interview. It can take weeks, it can take months, the story, to eventually be published. And then there's also opinion pieces, which maybe aren't necessarily about the facts, but more about this person's opinion or what they think about an issue. And so as reporters, we've both worked in almost all these different places and different mediums and different processes, and we're happy to answer questions about this at the end and share what we've learned about what we think is important about the process, and if you have any questions about what that means if a journalist who's working on a daily newspaper approaches you versus an investigative journalism program that's on television. So as I mentioned, each outlet has a different way to pick which stories they cover, their editorial process. They might have a meeting at the beginning of every day and discuss what should be covered and assign it. They might have a process that involves the community, which is one that Alia and I will talk about a little bit more in terms of having more of an engaged process of what an outlet might cover. And so when pitching, when sharing your ideas and trying to get coverage at different news outlets, it's important to know all of this information before you approach an organization. What kind of stories are they telling? How do they tell them? And how do they decide what stories to uncover? So we're going to be talking a little bit about some of these things, and we'll also be talking about a toolkit that Alia and I produced, but we'll talk about that a little later.
Journalism and kind of how the media works and prioritizes stories can seem like a little bit of a black box to people who are outside the media. So we thought we would highlight a few points about what is, okay, great, everyone can hear me. So what is newsworthy? What makes journalists tick? So there's sort of 5 different features of what gets, key features that generally helps things get into the news and into the media. First of all, if something is new or unexpected, something new has been announced, like Prime Minister Trudeau promising to welcome 25,000 refugees to Canada. Those kinds of stories are pretty obvious ones that fall into this category. But unexpected stories about things and developments that are ongoing in our society can also be considered newsworthy. So for example, I recently read an article in the CBC about a project in Manitoba that gives Yazidi refugees a chance to be involved with farming, which is something they did back home. Farming and refugees are not a connection that people make often. In addition, farming is not an industry which we hear about new people turning to for employment. We hear more about crises in the industry. So that's an example of a development that's unexpected. Journalists also tend to look for stories that shed light on an important public issue. So this can be problems with how the system works, but it could also be stories about solutions and things that we can learn from other countries or projects in different parts of Canada about how to improve something around a public issue. Third, journalists look for stories about things that impact people's lives, things that really get at their hearts and emotions, like issues related to their health, their security, and changes that are going to affect the place where they live. So this can, happen in positive and negative ways. When we see media outlets kind of fear-mongering around refugees and refugee claimants crossing borders, a lot of that is tapping into people's concerns about their safety and security. Fourth, journalists are always looking for stories that are interesting or entertaining. Having strong characters, drama, and tension are all things that kind of help draw people in and make the issue more human. And finally, if it seems like it can go viral, that's something that doesn't hurt. So obviously, all of these factors are also affected by the slant of a media outlet, how progressive it is and how conservative. But when you are trying to figure out how to get something in the news and what angle to pitch it from, these are some good angles and perspectives from which to start. So I'll hand it over to Francesca now, who's going to talk about a project that we worked on to center refugees in media coverage.
So the project that we ended up creating was a toolkit. We created 2 different toolkits. One was for journalists covering refugee stories. We wanted to find ways to ensure that the coverage was more nuanced and that it went beyond just the crisis and the headlines. And then the second toolkit was for newcomers. What kind of questions do newcomers have when you're approached by the media? What kind of questions do people have about journalism and how it works in Canada? Because it's very different all around the world. And so the reason that we decided to do this project was because we were going to be covering refugee stories for the outlet that we worked at called The Discourse, and we wanted to approach it from a different way. We didn't want to just go in and assume anything. We wanted to learn from the community and hear what we could be doing better and ways that we could be more compassionate in our reporting. And so we partnered with Pacific Immigrant Resources Society. Is there anyone here from Pacific? Woo, yeah, thank you. And from Options Community Services. Is anybody here from Options? And so with these 2 organizations, they helped us reach out to the community and find safe places to have conversations about what kind of things could the media be doing better? What kind of stories were we missing? And also, how could we be explaining the role of a journalist in ways that really made it clear and safe for people to share their stories. And so one of the things that we heard was that there was a need for more stories of refugees in their own words. And so we worked to create this toolkit, and it was really a collaboration with the people who came to our sessions. We had over 30 people come from all over. We had from Afghanistan, this is a list of some of the countries, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Iraq, and we heard so many different perspectives, and it was all included in a toolkit that we ended up publishing and sharing, and we're going to go into more details about some of the tips that we learned and shared, and we hope that this can become a growing resource that we can keep contributing to and sharing and learning from.
So there were a few key themes that emerged from our workshops with refugees and refugee claimants that has affected our journalism and also the information that we included in our toolkit, our aim is to help improve coverage of refugee issues and use that as a resource. Here we also have Sarah Lopez in the photo, and she is going to be joining us later on the panel. She's one of the people who participated in our workshops and helped us put this whole project together. So the first theme that came out of the workshops was a need for more diverse stories. And when we talk about diverse, it's diverse from multiple angles. So the refugees and refugee claimants who attended the workshop, they said they'd like to see more stories, first of all, about diverse refugees, so see diverse voices, because a lot of the coverage in the Canadian media has been about Syrian refugees and their experience. But as I'm sure this audience knows, there are about, I think according to UNHCR, about 25 or 26 million refugees worldwide, and about 1/4 of those are from Syria. So there is a lot of Syrian refugees, but there are so many more experiences. And so the participants said they would like to see more of those voices come out in the media. The second type of diversity in stories that we talked about was looking beyond the crisis. So our participants were concerned that there's a lot of coverage of the crisis, but not what happens after, and not solutions to the problem. And both of those things are needed to help advance the public conversation and help build solutions around refugee issues. And finally, the participants asked us to, about covering stories that look at the varied resettlement challenges. Because too often there is coverage of refugees coming to Canada, but not so much about what's happening to them after. I think sometimes journalists are guilty of falling into kind of a fairy tale trope. This is something that was pointed out to me by Mohammed Al-Saleh, who some of you may know, and he basically said there's this idea that refugees go through all this awful suffering, they come to Canada, and then they live happily ever after. And obviously it's so much more complicated than that, but journalists have a role to play in highlighting the nuance and what happens. It looks like there's some glitches with our PowerPoint with the numbering, unfortunately. I think there was a transfer of different versions of PowerPoint. But the second point that came out of the workshops was how the media covers refugees has a big impact on the experience of refugees when they're interacting with Canadians. And this comes across in both positive and negative ways. So on the negative front, there were some people who came to our workshop who'd run into a lot of people who didn't actually know what the legal definition of a refugee was. And instead, they had these negative ideas of linking refugees to war and crime and poverty without any sense of their suffering. And that affected how the people they met treated them. On the positive side, some people felt that they were constantly being treated like victims because they were refugees, and people were feeling pity for them, but not seeing who they were beyond this refugee label. The third theme that came out of the workshop was that a lot of people who attended had questions about how journalism and the media industry work. And this was something that kind of surprised me as a journalist, because I went in already having written quite a lot about refugees and interacted with a lot of them. And what really came out was that the people who participated were from all kinds of countries with a lot of differences in how the media industry operates. So for example, a lot of refugees come from authoritarian regimes where the media is controlled by journalists, or speaking to a journalist can be very risky. And if they're not familiar with the media system in Canada, this can affect how they perceive and respond to journalists here. So journalists have a real responsibility to clarify the process here and what the possible consequences of their stories are. Now, the fourth point that came out of our workshop was that there's a need for more compassionate follow-up by journalists. So the participants called for this in two ways. On the one hand, they said they were concerned about kind of spot coverage of refugees. So for example, a foreign journalist showing up to a refugee camp in Africa for one day, writing a story and then forgetting about it. They're concerned that this kind of coverage doesn't follow important developments and also doesn't keep these issues in the public eye. On the other hand, they also wanted to see more compassionate follow-up with refugees who are in individual stories. So for example, one person who attended was concerned that it often seems like journalists, they meet a refugee one day, they sort of extract their story and treat the refugee as the flavor of the month. Whereas he would have liked to see more of them following up about what happens after the story to keep an eye on the issue and also you have a more compassionate interaction. Oh, yes, and also, I just selected this quote from a Syrian refugee who works at a bakery in Langley because I felt it really highlighted some of the key points I've just mentioned to you. He told us that we see the same picture of refugees, who are people in hell and begging for something. We may pass this situation for a time. For myself, I passed that. I slept in the streets and whatever. But also we face a different kind of difficulties. So this just really highlighted that he wanted coverage of the variety of challenges refugees face, but also this sense of wanting to be seen as someone more than a refugee, and moving past this label and seeing refugees as complex people just like everybody else in our society.
So we're going to delve a little bit into the actual toolkits and what we learned. These are short links to the toolkits themselves, so you can go onto our website. You can also find them at thediscourse.ca, which is where they were published. And as I mentioned, there were two main different toolkits that we ended up publishing. But before we move on, I just wanted to check the room and see if there was any questions or if there was anything that we sped through really quickly that you wanted us to go back to. We'll have a chance to really discuss things later, but yeah. Great, so the question was around service providers and how to include them in this kind of conversation. And I'll log that one so that we can discuss it afterwards. But we mentioned that these toolkits, we partnered with Pacific Immigrant Resource Society as well as Options, who offer different types of services, and some of the people who work at both of those places were part of the conversations as well, and so they were part of the discussions as well as the development of the toolkit. But yeah, we can bring that up again in the discussion. Great question. So. Yeah, it looks like no numbers translated, but we have two toolkits. So the best practices for journalists, that one was, as I mentioned, the audience was for people covering refugee stories. Things to remember, we touched on some of them briefly about explaining the practice more, having compassionate follow-up, and you can read more about it online, and we're also happy to answer more questions. The toolkit that we're going to delve into a little bit more today, and Alia is going to cover the first 5 tips, and then I'm going to cover the next 5, which are tips for refugees and newcomers when dealing with journalists, or if you're approached to share your story with the media.
So the reason we're focusing on tips for refugees is we felt that that might be most relevant for this audience, but we're happy to discuss our tips for best practices for journalists later on as well, as Francesca mentioned. So we had 10 key tips for refugees. The first tip was to ask journalists questions before agreeing to an interview. Because we heard quite a few experiences of refugees who found themselves in uncomfortable situations around interactions with journalists and not really understanding what was going to happen in the interview and also how the information was going to be used. And as I mentioned earlier, the participants had a lot of questions about the media. So in our toolkit, we have a list of questions the refugees can ask a journalist to get an understanding of how the process is going to work. For example, what medium are they publishing the story in? Will they record audio, photo, video? How will they use the quotes? What is the topic? Can the journalist share examples of past work? And a whole kind of list of questions like that that can be really helpful in clarifying the process. Our second tip for refugees was that if you agree, be prepared to have your image and voice recorded. And also to be aware of the consequences of this, because a lot of Canadian media publish online, and sometimes these images and recordings can go all over the world. So it's really critical for people to be aware of that going in, and also to let the journalist know if they have any concerns about that.
And I would just add too that sometimes you might get a phone call from a journalist, and they would introduce themselves as a journalist and start asking questions. At that point, I would always recommend, ask right away, is this being recorded? Am I on the record? Are you hoping to use this for a story? Like right away, because in Canada, it's legal to record a phone call as long as one person gives consent, and that person can be the person calling you. So sometimes it's not clear. If it's not clear, ask right away.
Definitely, that's really important, because a lot of times journalists make assumptions that, this person knows I'm a journalist, they're talking to me, I can publish this. But, in this topic, there's a need for more sensitivity than there is with other types of news. So the third point that we had was for refugees to ask to see the organization's journalistic principles and practices. And also, as I mentioned earlier, to ask the journalist what kind of story they're working on. So a lot of organizations will have some kind of document or publish this on their website. The Discourse has 10 principles that are highlighted on its website. And looking at these practices can really help get a sense of how this outlet works, and what values are guiding their coverage as well. And also, sorry, to add on the type of story, as Francesca mentioned earlier, the turnaround for a daily news story looks very different than a feature. For a daily news story, a journalist might only interview somebody once, but for a feature, the interactions may happen over several months or a week, depending on what the turnaround is. And opinion pieces similarly can look very different from straight news stories in terms of how information is presented. So the fourth recommendation we had was to look at the past coverage of a media outlet and see where they stand. So people who are being interviewed can get a sense of the political slant and not accidentally find their faces or words being associated with something that they are uncomfortable with. And the fifth point is that if a refugee is worried about being identified, they should tell the reporter before the interview and confirm what actions will be taken to protect the identity. So ideally, a responsible journalist should bring up this conversation themselves, but it's really important for refugees when they're sharing their story to make sure that this is integrated into the process so there is no harm. I'll just pass it on to Francesca for the remainder of the tips.
And so with that idea that being aware of how your identity might be used in this story, it's important to remember that your story could be seen around the world, even if this publication might be a small publication. If it's just, you might think, oh, it's just a local newspaper or a school newspaper. Many of these places have online publications. They share things on social media. It can be picked up by other media. So once you speak to a journalist, it can be hard to control exactly who and where it gets shared.
Do journalists make sure that when they're talking to the refugees, they have an interpreter who explains these things to them?
That's a great question. It depends on the organization and how much resources they have. For example, at our workshops, we didn't have the resources to have interpreters. So one of the barriers was that participants had to be able to understand the concepts and be able to discuss these things in English. But if that isn't something that is needed, it is important to say that at the beginning of the process, because many journalist organizations, I would guess, don't have that accessible, at least right away. But perhaps for longer projects, this might be something that they could access resources to. But in general, that's not something that many journalists have.
Because a lot of these refugees are very vulnerable people. They're so glad that they've come to this country. So when somebody comes and asks them questions, they will answer. And I've seen cases where they don't want their faces to be, seen, or like victims of torture, who, when explaining about their torture, suddenly see whatever they've explained has been filmed, and then they fear for their families back home. So
I think one of the things that, like Alia mentioned, was that one of the things that was a learning for us as well was that it was so important to explain the process and what it means to speak to a journalist in Canada, and that also means that it's okay to say no. You can say no to a journalist, and you don't have to speak. And even if you say yes, and you, for whatever reason, become uncomfortable with the questions, or you feel at any point that this isn't something that you believe that you had agreed to, you can say no. Like but the problem is that it is definitely part of a journalist culture, which I don't think is good. But people, they want to be able to get a story because that's what their job is, right? And so part of the toolkit, we wanted to help educate journalists and let them know that when handling these kinds of stories, it's important to create a space that at any time it should be okay for someone to back out and say that you don't want your story to be included. But so before you say yes to an interview, it's one of the things that can help with the situation is to really look at the publication's previous stories, see, as Alia mentioned, their principles and their practices. Like, what kind of an organization are they? Do they incorporate this kind of compassion in their storytelling? Sometimes you can tell that from the principles and practices, and sometimes you can tell that from past stories. But yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely something that should be more top of mind when journalists are out in the field. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that? No, I think you're great. Sure. We'll just, being told, hold the questions, keep them in your mind, and then we'll have lots of chance to do that afterwards. But these are great questions, and I'm glad that these are coming up. And so the next point is to be prepared to back up parts of your story with documentation, photos, or names of people you know. Again, part of a journalist's job is to ensure the accuracy of a story. It is one of the most important things that journalists do, is that ensure that the stories that they are sharing are truthful, that they're factual, and a hard part of the job is sometimes trying to uncover things that might not have a document to back it up. But as much as possible, journalists will ask you for these things. They'll ask you for documentation, they might ask you for photos or names of people you know. And that's part of the process of verifying a story and making sure that readers can believe what is being told. And so, the question that was just brought up, it's confirming what kind of a conversation that you're having with a journalist right away is really important. So there's different kinds of conversations that you might have with a journalist. On the record is the most common, and it is probably one that some journalists will assume that this conversation is on the record when you're talking with them. Again, something that we wanted to encourage as part of a culture is to explain what kind of a conversation a reporter is having with someone before they start asking questions. So telling someone that this conversation is on the record means that anything and everything that you say to this person could be published somewhere. It means maybe that you're being recorded. It might be obvious because there might be a big camera in front of your face or a recorder, but on the record means that anything and everything that you say can be published. On background, that is a bit of a more casual conversation. Normally that happens when a reporter is just trying to learn more about a subject. It can still mean that the things that you say are published. It might not mean that you might be quoted. It's important to clarify if a reporter says to you, oh, I just want to have a conversation on background. Ask them, what does that mean to you? Does that mean that you might quote me? So on background and on the record are two very common ways to have a conversation with a journalist. And as we mentioned earlier, it's important to figure out what kind of stories have been told in the past by this organization, as well as the reporter, because reporters will work for many different organizations. Reporters also, you can easily Google them and find out what past stories they've done. So that's another step before saying yes. Look up the reporter and look up the organization. And the last tip is to be prepared that speaking about past traumas can be stressful and triggering. This was something that we heard in the workshops, and in our toolkit, we list a number of places that have resources available for newcomers to access and help with this process. Again, this might be something that you want to bring up with a reporter before you start your interview, is that you can ask them what kinds of questions they're going to be asking. Reporters don't generally share questions ahead of an interview, but you are able to ask them what kind of topics are you going to be covering, and let them know ahead of time that perhaps some topics are off limits, or that in order to talk about certain things, you would need access to resources.
I would also just add there that, if you're at a settlement organization and you're trying to help a refugee who wants to share their story that has gone through trauma that's difficult to talk about, maybe you can find other ways to share those experiences with the journalist. So for example, last year I wrote a story about the struggles refugees face in terms of accessing mental health supports. And I interviewed a woman from Afghanistan who'd had some very traumatic experiences. She wanted to share them, but rehashing them with me in an interview wasn't necessarily critical to the story, but would help the story. So her statement that she filed when she made her refugee claim, she shared a copy of that with me in English. And so these are the kinds of things that people who work with refugees can help the refugee brainstorm to help with the process.
And so that's the toolkit. We're almost done. We just have this last 2 slides. But if the last thing that we wanted to share was, if you're looking to pitch a story, if you are reaching out to a journalist or a journalism organization with the hope that you have a story that you want to share or a topic that you think is important that they should cover, these are some things that, just some quick tips that we have to consider before pitching. So research the organization who you're sending the pitch to. What do they normally cover? What kinds of stories do they tell? Would they be interested in the topic or issue that you are pitching? You can look and see in their past coverage. Reaching out to individuals when possible, instead of the generic email that might be available. So if there's a reporter, you can often go on Twitter. That's a great place to reach out to journalists and very specifically reach out to a reporter who might be interested in a story. Remember, what is newsworthy? Some of the things that we discussed at the very beginning of our presentation. Include quotes or people's stories in your pitch. So you want to keep it short, 1 to 2 paragraphs, but within those paragraphs, if you can include quotes and people in that, not just facts about an issue, but make it personal, make a connection with people. Write as if you're telling a friend a story. So make it compelling, make it a story. And finally, don't hesitate to follow up by phone with whoever you've emailed your pitch to. It's great to, don't feel bad about bugging them. Journalists bug people all the time.
Journalists also get a lot of emails, so even if they're interested in something, sometimes they miss it, so a reminder is really helpful. To wrap up, we had a few things we wanted to ask you about. First of all, we found that the people who we've shared the toolkit with, they found it to be a really useful resource. So we'd like to try to spread the word. We also want to translate it into more languages so more people can access it. It's already been translated into French for journalists in Quebec. But in the audience, if you have want to help, have suggestions of grants we can use to make it happen or anything like that, please approach us at lunch. We would love your support, and also any suggestions you have for improving the toolkit. And Francesca just wanted to add something.
And lastly, I mentioned the organization that we both worked for to create this toolkit was the discourse.ca. You can go online and find some of the stories there and support our work by visiting our website, and you can subscribe to become a member of the discourse, and that means you'd be following our work access to our work is all online, and you can see some of the stories that we've produced as part of this toolkit on there as well.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We are going to start the Q&A session. So, Sarah Lopez is joining us, and before that, I want to share my thoughts and about the session. Honestly, I am so grateful saying this, that I'm really lucky being a woman living in Canada, and grateful to be a refugee to Canada. So now, how can we move from being just refugees to what I want to be? Canada is a global leader when it comes to supporting receiving refugees. Last year, there were like 46,500 refugees that migrated to Canada. This number is going to increase overall each year, which shows that it is crucial in our work to work on the integration process overall to build not only diverse, but inclusive, healthy, and connected communities. And definitely media is playing an integral role in sharing our stories and portraying an image to the general public. As a settling refugees, one of the initial thoughts that I would have if I was asked to speak up or share my story, why the hell would I share my story? I'm working day and night to save my life from scratch. I know this topic might be beyond our content for today, but I thought sharing from inside out would help us find effective and productive approaches to change the narration. Because we do need more stories to come out, but this time it will come out from the refugee lens. With these stories, hopefully we will be able to contribute positively to the process of refugees' integration and belongingness. And without further ado, I want to introduce Sarah. Sarah Lopez is originally from Mexico, worked as a high school teacher at UNAM. She was also a human rights activist, and due to this job fled her country in 2010, went to US as an asylum seeker, and after more than 2 years in deportation process, decided to abandon that country in October 2012. Sarah crossed Canadian borders on her foot in late 2012 and was accepted as a protected person in 2014. After holding a variety of volunteer positions at local agencies working with refugees, Sarah was offered a position with Vancouver Association of Survivors of Torture in 2018, where she still works today. So I want to start with asking Sarah if you can share with us about your involvement in the creation of the toolkit and how have you found it useful in your interaction with media.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. And thank you to Francesca and Alia for this amazing experience working with you. Actually, I have had very bad experience with the mass media in the States and in Canada. So I just found myself in the Vancouver Sun newspaper. I was waiting for my job, starting my job, and I read my own story in the newspaper without my permission. So this is how and why I decided to participate in this kit tool.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight. So our next question will be for Alia and Francesca. In my experience, I found that when I am being interviewed, which didn't happen a lot of time, the questions are always about my past, which is sometimes difficult to speak about. I would like to focus more onto my current life in Canada and how I am involved with my community and my new work in a startup company. So do you have any suggestions for me to redirect conversation and into a more positive angle about our story?
Sure. I can start. I think that you raised a really important point here, and one of our tips for best practices for journalists was to ask refugees exactly about these types of questions, like what is their life like now, what do they care about, what is their profession, rather than just using the label of, such and such said, a refugee from X. Like,
think about other ways to describe people. And in terms of focusing on the present and the things that you're excited about, I would recommend telling the journalist in the interview, like exactly as you've told us now that, that you're concerned that it's only on the past and there's these other issues and this is what you're doing now. I think that is probably the best way to tackle this issue, because from a journalistic perspective, sometimes journalists are so focused on getting the story, they have a deadline, that they don't necessarily take time to consider the broader issues. But an interview is about two people, the journalist and the person being interviewed, and the person being interviewed should also recognize their role in shaping the conversation.
And I think also before the interview starts, you can also ask them a bit more about the story and who else they're talking to, because then that might also help frame how your story gets told. If you ask them, what other organizations are you approaching? Who else are you talking to? Will you be talking to, for example, if it's an issue that means that the government should respond or the government has some sort of accountability, will they be talking to the government about this? Because then you might be able to bring up the fact that solutions are a really important thing to include in stories, and what happens after someone arrives in Canada. It's not just, it doesn't just end there. So pointing out that solutions are an important part of the story and that it shouldn't just focus on the past. But it is a challenge because journalists will have sometimes a very specific story that they have in their minds and that they're trying to get very quickly. You mentioned sometimes there isn't a lot of time, and that happens a lot with daily journalists because they have deadlines that are very, very quick. They have to turn around a story by the end of the day. But if you have the opportunity to speak with someone who's working with a longer deadline, maybe that's something that you can bring up and feel a bit more comfortable with. But with a daily journalist, it will be harder to push that and ensure that is also included in the story, because also the stories that get told in daily news are so quick. And so you might talk to someone for an hour and find that one sentence is included. And that's kind of just how the process is. It doesn't mean that your time wasn't valued, but it's just kind of part of the process, which is sometimes an unfortunate part that have to get left out.
No worries. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insight there. There are some protocols in journalism, and definitely trying our best from both sides, as refugees and journalists, to come up into that common space to create a better story for both the refugees and for the media. And yeah, so we can go further into the other question. So this question is for Sarah. Do you feel that having this direct connection with the discourse and to experienced journalists has helped you in sharing your story with the media better? Has it helped you dispel the mystery of how the media operates and what they are looking for?
It was very helpful for me due to the very bad experience in the past, and having this knowledge that I can say no to one question and stop the interview and say, give me a second, I'm having a hard time, and avoiding this traumatic experience that 100% of the refugees have passed. Mm-hmm. It's very useful. It's not only as a refugee, but it's also as someone from the audience asked about the traumatic experience, how to approach to this experience and to these people that have survived to many different horrors in their past. So this is very useful, and the fact that you are listened, someone really listened, is paying attention, your reactions, and not only what happened, because sometimes it's very tricky, these questions, why you are here, no? Mm-hmm. What happened? These just two questions are very triggering for a refugee claimant or a protected person. Doesn't matter how long it's been here, these two questions are very triggering. And as in the morning session, someone says, it's very important not only focus in the past, but in the challenge that we face as newcomers in this country. Doesn't matter the tag, but it's very important to face that and pointing this into a specific type of education, educating the society in order to avoid this more tagging for the refugees.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can really resonate with that, the part of like being asked why you are here, or what, like it makes you feel like, did you struggle enough to be in Canada? And this would be one of the 2 points that I'll be mentioning later on the presentation. And the other part comes to education of like, I had never, or me, or like most of the refugees maybe did not interact with media. So is there capacity building? Yes, there is a toolkit, but there is so much soft skills that come with it. And part of my questions today would be like, which is the next one, as I had my first experience with media a couple months ago, and although I'm usually very vocal and expressive, when I talk, I actually was very conservative at that interview because I felt like I have no authority to explain myself or edit myself because I'm recorded once, right? So English is not my first language, and I feel that is true for most of us as refugees. How did you create that safe space for refugees to share and shape their story in the way that they feel safe? So like tips and tricks in the research that you have done, so others could learn also of your practices.
For the workshops that we had, how we created a safe space partly was we let people know that for the workshops, anything that we decided to use in the toolkits, whether it was photos or quotes, if we were going to be using people's names, we were going to call them before and let them know and share the toolkit with them ahead of publication. That's a practice that sometimes happens, but it was something that we thought was really important to let people know how their names and images would be used, and because we wanted this toolkit to be shared widely. And so when people were invited to the workshops, there wasn't any requirement to go on the record. There wasn't any requirement to have your photo or image shared. So that was one of the ways that we created a safe space, just to be very clear about how people's names were being used. And we sought consent after the toolkits were done and drafted from people to have whether or not they wanted their names included, because we wanted to give credit to all these people who gave their evenings to share their experiences with us. But we also understand that having your name published and shared might not be something that could be an option for people. It could be a not safe situation. So that was one of the things that we did. And in terms of language barrier, yeah, unfortunately we didn't have the resources to have translators available, but that's something that I wish we could have had.
Yes, definitely. And I also just want to address like what journalists can do to help create a safe space as well when doing interviews in general. So some of the best practices that we have in there are, as we said, for journalists to explain how the process works and what will be recorded and what the story is about, and also to make it really clear to people that they can say no to answering a question, and that's okay, or check if there's any topics they don't want to come up. Doing the interview at a place that is safe, feels safe for the person they're interviewing, and also having some resources at hand that they can point a person to if traumatic things do come up. I think that settlement organizations and groups that work with refugees can really help with these things. Usually, those are the groups that journalists go to when they want to interview a refugee, because it's hard for them to like find someone in some other ways, unless if they happen to have a personal connection. And I think sometimes, like if people who are making these introductions can have these conversations with the journalists in advance, that can really help. Like over the years, I have been helped by a number of groups across Canada who work with refugees and immigrants to set up interviews. And some of them have flagged some of these things with me, and some of them haven't. And when organizations don't, I think it's really hard for a journalist to be mindful of these issues. For me, because I was constantly covering it, I was aware, but there are also journalists who get thrown on a refugee story, but that's not what they regularly cover. So if they're not aware, you know, having that conversation with them beforehand can be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, and that actually brings me to the next question. But first, I will check with the audience. Do you have any question? Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting because this is a huge part that sometimes we come to ignore in the issue of refugees and their settlement. So I would first have a recommendations, a request, and particularly to the agency, the settlement agency. I would like that a workshop about the toolkits and how to deal with journalists is part of the settlement in the past of the first few days. In my experiences with the Syrian refugees during their settlements, they got overwhelmed and they didn't know exactly how to navigate that terrain. It was a very traumatizing experience for them sometimes just to be put under the spot. So this is, I request from all the refugee, settlement agencies, ISS of BC, PRS, all the neighborhood houses, because these are the first encounters. Another question is a kind of command and questions coming also from my positionality, and I work with the refugees, is that in the toolkit also, especially when we are addressing as journalists, I think we have too much of the homogenizing stories about the refugees, as if like the refugees is a one story fits all. Refugees themselves, they have very diversified experiences. The trauma of displacement is totally, completely different. One of the highlights of my work when I worked with refugee youth, it's dealing with the refugees, asking them, interviewing them, is a huge task that needs a lot of homework. And journalists, they need to do their homework because it's not only about the trauma, because many people in their displacement, the level of trauma is completely different. So less homogenizations of the stories of the refugees. And a second thing, I like your questions about, and what's next? Because we usually stop at this kind of highlight experience when we are on the top of the curve, the moment of joy, of excitement. I would like to see stories with refugees after 2 years of their settlement. Go and ask the same refugees after 2 years and see how this excitement is going to be disappearing because of so many challenges that we don't arrive to capture. So another thing is that in the toolkit is how we can see the experience and the story after a few years from now. Keep record of the people that you have interviewed, because the stories are totally, completely different. From a refugee camp to a 2-bedroom apartment in Vancouver with the excitement of media, this might be something interesting for the newly arrived refugees. But just after a few years, we start having this kind of, the fading of the excitement, and the real challenges are popping up. And at this moment, particular in the settlement, we need to see clearly what are the challenges, the real challenges. And particularly, I'm addressing the issues of youth, intergenerational problems, issues of, parental control, issues of languages, issues of being out of the school after you come here after 6 months. So many stories are available here, but we need also to know how to approach them. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. There were a lot of insights, and I was able, honestly, to reflect back to my journey when I moved first to Toronto. So as a refugee, we always, first when we arrive here, we go through our immigration process, settling, and everybody feels like interviewing us, and we have that internalized feeling of being appreciative, and it's really hard to say no. And I started to say no just last month. So it might be easy to tell us, just say no, but it's actually more challenging than what it seems like. So adding up into the workshop, definitely that will help us to create those skills and learn how to speak with media. It won't be like, just, like read a book and then go and talk to them. So definitely that transition stage of building capacity will help. And I think, okay, we'll go to the next question. This is again for Francesca and Alia. How do those of us who came to Canada as refugees are interested in being advocates and speakers directly build our network with media to building a relationship with specific media outlets or journalism and influencers? I think basically how, as people, we had maybe previous or wanted to start our media, our speaking, how can we start it here?
So how to pitch stories and how to get a story covered. Some of the tips that we have include making a targeted pitch, so looking for specific reporters or specific news outlets that cover these kinds of issues and cover them in a way that you respect and believe in. And then including in your pitch when you reach out information about how to contact you, as well as like a very short summary of the story that you think that they should cover and why. And in the pitch, like we mentioned at the very end, try to make sure that there's like a personal story, that it doesn't have to be yours, but if you have people's voices included, it makes it a lot more powerful and interesting for a journalist organization to want to pick it up.
Yeah, definitely. And okay, this might sound a bit tacky, but like journalists are always looking for the sexiest story, or what's going to make it exciting or dramatic. And I think trying to figure out what aspect of the story is going to really grab people's attention and putting that front and center can really help draw attention to issues. The challenge with some of these topics around resettlement is they're ongoing, so they're not always new. And so things that can help them get covered is if new research comes out, if there's a new development or a new project, or if you can find some good characters or problems or issues around people's well-being that you can highlight as a trend. I think that can really help. And finally, I think refugees have really compelling stories, not just about what happened to them before they came to Canada, but their experience of being here, how they perceive things and settling down. And I think highlighting some of those stories in a catchy way can really help to grab attention. I think you also asked about how you can build a network with journalists. I think that that can be hard because it depends on a lot of different factors, how regularly the journalist covers these issues, how long they stay at a media outlet, what their editors are interested in, how much time they have for these kinds of stories. But I think it can be helpful to just email them. Like if somebody has written a story about you and something new has come up, reach out to them and let them know, or follow up with them and just tell them, I'm so glad that you did this, but this is happening in this area of the city, and I think it really needs attention, and just kind of keep a casual conversation with them going as you see issues. It will also lead them to start considering you as a source for information about that topic.
Thank you. So this question is open to everyone. And yes, you have a question? Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, I think the first time I asked for a question, I didn't say my name. So my name is Carmen. I work at Little Mountain Neighborhood House, and I'm also a journalist. And I think we have been hearing about the importance of bringing our stories out there for the media, mainstream media, corporate media, which kind of media? When we have our stories out there, I know journalists make their efforts to get our stories, all the facts, evidence, but at the end, who decides what is published and how it's published? So I think the conversation goes beyond of how to navigate I think the work is even harder because it depending the political angle of the media. It's the Vancouver Sun, the CBC. You're saying there is a difficult when people don't speak English. So those stories from the grassroots, they don't have time for translators. So that's why not, right? We're saying, oh, it had to be on the day. Why we cannot challenge that? That is status quo of the media. And also remember, we can create our own media. That's what alternative media. Refugees can create their own outlets. Now, more than ever, technology. I work on radio for a group of exiles, political refugees who come from Latin America in the mid-70s. They started their own radio show that at this end has been 42 years on air and continues. So it's possible not see media as something, wow, how we can reach that. We can create our own media, but at the same challenging also the mainstream media. I don't know if it's a comment or would like to have your thoughts on that.
I think those are all really great points. There's so many types of media and so much power for people to tell their own stories. So I think for newcomers who want to share their stories, taking a step back and thinking about what your goals are, who you want to reach and why you want to share your story, I think that can really affect which medium you choose to tell it in. And if you tell your story yourself, you'll have much more control over it than when you go to a mainstream media outlet, because generally speaking, mainstream media outlets, you know, as a policy, journalists don't let people see their stories before publication. There may be parts of the interview that you felt were really important but might not fit into the final story. And interviewees don't have that much control over that, although they can clarify with the journalist what their aim is and what the story will look like and say what they think is important. It's just a different level of control. And I want to highlight there's a really cool media outlet out of Montreal called Media Refugees. They've been doing a lot of coverage of refugee stories and like translating people's personal experiences and things. So I think that's a cool place to check out if you want to hear some of the kind of stories that I think Carmen, right, was chatting about.
I love what you said.
Yes.
And do we have any more questions from the audience? Yep, go ahead.
Hello again. This question kind of goes a little bit back to what we were talking about regarding, you know, journalists interacting with refugees. But I just, especially coming from the social work background, and I know informed consent is a big thing within the profession, and I know that varies from journalists. But my question would be around perhaps adding to the toolkit with working with refugees and helping them to understand if they are going to share their story, what are the types of consent? Because I could be sharing my story and you say, okay, yes, I will add that, or no, I won't add that, but is it documented? So I just wanted to know from the journalist, what are the parameters for informed consent? Is there like a contract that is signed? What if I've shared a story and then no, I don't want the story to be published? And if, let's say, the journalist published something that I didn't want to be shared, what are the repercussions? Who do I go to? What's the source of help in that regard? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think, so like we mentioned, you're right, it is important to have this for journalists. Part of the toolkit was challenging that idea and reminding journalists that it is important to throughout the interview process, throughout the interactions, whether that's if you follow up with an email after a conversation, whether it's a photo, whether you share a document, that every part of the step, the journalist has to make clear how that information is being used. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And so, that was a tip that we had for journalists, and then the tips that we had for newcomers was that before engaging or before sharing, to be clear about how something might be used. The thing is, even if you share something with a journalist, that doesn't mean that they will use it. And so if you're sharing it with the hope that you really need this part to be included as part of the story, that doesn't always happen. You might share like I mentioned, it could be an hour-long interview and you had a part of your story that you were really hoping would be included and it wasn't included in the story. That's part of the process of journalism, and unfortunately it's not, journalists can't promise that certain things will be in a story all the time. Maybe that is something that this journalist is willing to do, but it has to be part of the conversation ahead of time. And that's definitely something that journalists should be doing more of, and should be doing a better job of making clear about what is going to be included. If a story gets published and you see something in it that you had asked not to be included, if you feel comfortable reaching out to the reporter directly, definitely do that. Most journalist organizations have processes about retractions or corrections that need to be made. If you don't feel comfortable reaching out to the reporter for whatever reason, maybe you had a bad experience with them, I would recommend reaching out to their editor or reaching out to the publication if they have a general line. That way you make sure that someone sees it that isn't the reporter. Something that you could also ask before you agree to an interview is ask the journalist for their editor's name as well, so that if during the process there's something that happens that you don't feel comfortable, something that the reporter did or something that happened after publication, if you don't feel comfortable going to the reporter, you can go to the editor, which is basically the person who is in charge of everything that gets published in an organization.
Yeah, I think you've captured pretty much everything related to the question. I would just add that while journalists can't promise what will be in the story, they can make a promise and commitment around what will not be in the story. Many times in interviews, people may realize that they shouldn't have said something. There could be a security risk or another problem, and it's really important for them to let journalists know. Usually, journalists are quite sensitive to that when they're interviewing kind of a general member of the public who is in a vulnerable situation. For politicians and powerful people, if they say something and then they say they want to go off the record, it's like a no, you've already said it. But for people who don't know how the media works, I think journalists are cognizant of that. And a lot of times people can also say like, oh, I want to share something with you to like help you understand this issue, but I don't want you to publish it. So, asking journalists for those kind of commitments and flagging things is totally okay. And it's really important to make sure people know that when they go into the interview.
Well, in my own experience, in the States, I signed just one contract with the permission about what I said, and the second one was not signed. It was just a verbal agreement, which we thought that it was legal, and it was not. So this is the tricky part in the States, and my bad experience in Canada, it was like with the Vancouver Sun, when I read my own story published, and I said, no one asked me my permission. So this is one of the things, but working with the discourse, they ask, once they finish that the work that they made with all these hours that we worked together, they sent the request for permission about pictures, videos, and the parts that they were using for this work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry, I just wanted to add one more point, because I know some of you may be working with people sharing sensitive stories. In the past, like while I'm not able to share my story, sometimes when I'm dealing with a really sensitive thing that could put somebody at risk, I've had phone conversations with them after writing the article and reviewing the facts that I've included and confirming with them that none of them are risky, because sometimes they can get very complicated, and as a journalist you can accidentally make a mistake around somebody's security. So that is something that you can ask a journalist for even if they're unable to share their story.
Yeah, thank you so much for your all active participation. Thank you for joining us, Alia, Sarah, and Francesca. We have learned really a lot of things, and hopefully this will be like a start for the conversation and how we can build on this. And thank you for our live stream audience for joining us today. The recording of the live stream will be available next week on the BC Refugee Hub website. and we will send out an emails newsletter. So goodbye. We have now 1 hour lunch break, which will be found right outside. You can have your lunch outside on the UBC steps, or here in this room, or there are some chairs outside area as well. Just a reminder, after the lunch at 1 p.m., I think 1:30? Yeah. 1:15, okay. So we'll be back again at 1:15 p.m. You can go straight out to the breakout sessions. Rooms are listed on your agenda. And by the way, my presentation is at room C235. See you there.